Welcome to the Monday, June 19th, 2017 work session of the Falls Church City Council. We're delighted to have our colleagues from the school board here as well, including the superintendent and the chair of the school board, and I've got many folks in attendance, the planning commission and other bodies. This is a work session, which means that the public is welcome to listen but not participate at this particular hearing, but the next public hearing you're welcome to say your piece if you would like at the beginning of the meeting. But a lot is going on. Things are moving quickly. I don't know if, Mr. Webb, you have anything you'd like to say before we get started?
Are we supposed to be mic'd or?
Are we not mic'd?
It's not very loud. You were mic'd. But we're not projecting into the room. Not projecting at all. So, for the purposes of recording, you are mic'd, so you will not hear it in the room, but it's being recorded. Water and HVAC leaked all over the equipment. So we are using remote cameras and mics to record it for TV viewing, but you will not hear it in the room. You're working.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. Then, Mr. Shields, why don't we turn it over to you?
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council, Chairman Webb, and Superintendent Noonan. Just a note about the agenda for tonight. In the first part of the agenda, we want to provide you with some updates, and then from that, we'll take a look at the referendum, the draft referendum, which does not at this point have numbers plugged into it, but from tonight's discussion, we expect to come out of this meeting with numbers plugged into it for consideration at first reading on June 26th. And that would be an ordinance to set a referendum on the bonding for the high school. It's item 3 that we anticipate we'll spend probably most of our time tonight to talk about the CIP and the big question of affordability and risk. And this is a discussion that's been anticipated by the council. When you adopted your CIP on April 24th, you knew that you would be getting the feasibility study report, which we've all seen, and then take a look at adding that to the CIP, but do that in the context of all the projects that are in the CIP and what that debt profile looks like, and the feasibility of that. So that's where we anticipate we'll spend most of our time tonight. We do have a presentation for that piece of the meeting to review the CIP and what it means for annual debt service translated into impact on homeowners and tax rates. And we'll also present a modified CIP on the premise of having some projects come that are currently front-loaded in the CIP, have them occur after we've actually received the money for the land transaction associated with the high school. So that's the organizing principle behind a potentially modified CIP. And so that discussion will occur under item 3. And then lastly, stemming from the presentation 2 weeks ago on the City Hall project, we'd like to get back with the council with updates and responses to the questions that were asked. So it's a full agenda tonight. We'll try to move briskly through the material, but we understand these are pretty heavy issues, really heavy issues that are on the table for tonight and really are setting up for potential public actions a week from now and a targeted second reading on public actions at the end of July. So for the campus project, I can provide an update on the campus market study. Other members of the Economic Working Group can jump in as well, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Noonan for a feasibility study update, and then we have our friends from Cog who will brief the council on the geothermal study that was conducted over the past year.
Mr. Shields?
Yes.
Apologies. Without the room speakers, people are having trouble hearing in the back.
Okay, I will try to
we'll all need to
project
tonight,
a little bit
please.
more. So for the campus market study update, the city hired the firm of Alvarez and Marsal to conduct a valuation study for up to 10 acres of land on the high school campus site. They met on Friday with the Economic Working Group and gave an initial report to the Economic Working Group. We've got more work to do on that. And we'll get together again. We haven't talked with the chairs of that group yet, but we would propose in 2 weeks to respond to some of the questions that were asked and advance that valuation study. That what their conclusion is, if they take the development program of the Urban Land Institute's Technical Assistance Panel of in the fall of 2014, which had a roughly 70-30 residential to commercial ratio, had a mix of office, retail, condos, age-restricted housing, and entertainment uses, etc. They come to a value, if under that program, it was about 1.2 million square feet of uses that would occur on that 10 acres, an FAR of about 3.0. That they came to a conclusion that that would have a market value of approximately $43 million. And they indicated that that would, under the schedule that we've laid out for the school procurement process and our procurement process for taking this land to market, that if we had the goal of having a contract pending for in hand for that property in the year 2019, at the same time that we were then initiating the construction of the school will take 2 years plus to build, then the land would become available to that developer in the year 2022. So the year 2022 is when that land, right on the sort of the cusp between 21 and 22, is when that money would be available to the city to assist with the financing of the school. Now, of course, that's 2 years after we've already issued the bonds for the school. So when we start talking about the debt service and the feasibility of the capital improvements program, we're going to lay all that out and how that could get sequenced out. The city currently has $10 million in capital reserves, and that would play a very prominent role in bridging that 2-year financing gap. But we'll talk more about that at a later part of tonight's agenda. But so kind of the main point on Friday morning's meeting was that this valuation is a process, that value is very much determined by the city in terms of laying out what the allowable uses are, what kind of prescriptions or what kind of program we might put on the property when we take it to market. That married with then market cycles and the timing of those market cycles, that's really between those two things are what's going to drive value for the site. So when we talk about financing in a moment, we've used the figure of $40 million, which is not a new figure. We've used actually $40 million and really for the last 2 years in terms of the proceeds for the property. And that's based on information we've gotten from more informal sources. But we now have an independent valuation that confirms that that number is a good planning number. So next steps, we will get a first draft of the strategic marketing roadmap. We'll review that in 2 weeks, along with responses to the questions from the Economic Working Group on the valuation study. The goal is to come to council at your meeting on July 17th so that you can meet directly with Alvarez and Marcel after the Economic Working Group has gone through its work and get the final valuation report.
Thank you.
Before we go on, do anyone have any question, or does anyone have any questions about that? Most of you were at the working group, but does anyone have any questions on that portion of the presentation before we move on? Ms. Hardy?
So I was there, but just for the public's benefit, do you expect that the next iterations will show different mix of uses and then the corresponding value so that it, like you said, is kind of the city's choice? What we want there will determine the value. So will we get presented kind of like a menu that says, hey, if you want a 70-30 residential commercial use, it looks like this. If you want 50-50, it looks like this. And here's the likelihood that you might even get someone to come in for that. Do we expect that sort of iterative kind of value proposals?
Yeah, that is the work that will happen next. And so we'll put out a call for what Alvarez and Marcel would like to hear from the city in more detail is what are some of the key things that the city would have to have on this site? What are the or top values that the city has that might not be market driven but reflect our values, or might reflect our desire for tax yield as opposed to over the long term that might drive up the our desire for commercial on the site relative to residential. So that's the iterative process that will go forward from here. They've given us one value, and then they will be able to show the differences in value based on what those regulations or prescriptions might be.
So based on that, do you expect that we'll make a formal decision that says we want a mix that looks like this, so that we actually have a value that we can then base the referendum question and all the financial modeling on, or is that going to be kind of a community discussion? How do we envision that laying out?
When that decision would formally be made is when the city crafts the RFP and goes to market. And that would be after the referendum. If the city council wants to lay out some markers now, though, so that the community understands where the council is going with this, then that would need to be done in the, by Labor Day in order, for the September-October timeframe for the public to be informed about what those might be.
Yeah, but also note that that number does not include tax yield. So that number is basically fair market value of the property, essentially based on the ULI use mix that was done several years ago. So it's kind of a first cut at it, but that will change, as the city manager said, depending on uses we may desire or prescribe or don't want there. So I think that will be what will happen, and I think community discussion on that aspect is going to be important as well. But that does not include tax yield. And when is that number coming out, Mr. Shields? Do you know the tax yield numbers?
So the tax yield numbers we ran on the ULI study, so we can bring those forward. We've already done that. What the new work that will need to be done is for if we change the program, what would the tax, what's the fiscal impact of those changes?
All right, unless there's anything else, why don't we move on? Dr. Noonan?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, Mr. Shields, and Chairman Webb. Good evening. Just a very brief update on the feasibility study. Perkins Eastman, as everybody here knows, was retained a while ago prior to my arriving. And at this point, sort of the way that we were looking at the work was in phases. Sort of phase one was Perkins Eastman was going to do this feasibility study. The board would go through their process and select, and then we would turn it over to Mr. Shields and you all to think about now what would the economic development look like. At this point, the work of the feasibility group is completed. They presented us a number of conceptual designs as part of our process. We met with the school board, navigated those multiple options, and in the end landed on one particular option that seemed to meet the needs of the school programs the best, and that was Community One. I think everybody's familiar with that, and there's a pretty significant handout in your materials that kind of talks about that as well. The most recent update we've received from Perkins Eastman was at a public meeting a couple of weekends ago, where we shared where we were with respect to Community One, the criteria by which we measured the different options, and just for the public, those were based on public program accommodation. So would it meet the needs of the instructional program, outdoor athletic programs, Mary Ellen Henderson expansion potential in the future, building life cycle, economic development, meaning 10 acres, having sustainable goals, being walkable, bike, metro, bus accessible, looking at the phasing, was it a quick phase or was it no phase at all, constructability and the existing conditions and cost impact. And Community One was the particular design scheme that actually met with the highest level of grade for each of those criteria that were reviewed. Our next steps with Perkins Eastman, now that they've completed the conceptual models or conceptual designs, is we plan to re-engage them shortly after a decision is made with respect to the CIP in looking at a conceptual floor plan, so we can get more of a refined look of what the building would look like on the inside. And at that point, prior to the referendum question going out to the public, we believe that we can let the RFQ process begin, and then post-referendum, we can go out to RFP after we've narrowed the field to potentially 3 or 4 different vendors. So with that, Mr. Mayor, that's my update.
Okay, any questions?
Is this document, are there copies? I don't have
Got it off the table. Do you need one?
This is Dr. Noonan's letter?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
Yes. That's
Okay,
the-
that was in the packet. So if,
Okay, questions? Ms. Hardy?
where it was in the packet is under the
Agenda
CIP item, under Agenda 3. Just to,
3B.
yeah.
So maybe I'm skipping ahead because I was looking at that same attachment. I think last time we had met with the community, we talked about kind of options that could bring down that cost number. I wanted to see whether we're talking about that now or maybe in 3B. Is that one?
I guess we'll probably be talking about it in 3B when we give the total amount, but we did, just to preview 3B perhaps, we did look at the overall cost and were able to mitigate some of those costs based on some reduction in space and the like.
Okay, anything else? If not, why don't we move on to the Cog Geothermal Presentation. We're delighted to have two folks from Cog with us tonight, Steve Waltz and Maya Davis, who are going to be telling us, talking about some exciting options, very environmentally progressive options for our high school and the campus site. So welcome to you both. Thank you for coming down to see us. We
Thank
really
you very much,
appreciate it.
Mr. Mayor, Board Chairman, and members of both the council and the school board. I'm Steve Walls. I'm Director of Environmental Programs at the Council of Governments. It's on. And I have with me Maya Davis, who is on our staff in environmental programs here at the council. I think you may have copies of a couple of slides in front of you. I'll try and keep it fairly short. I know you have a full agenda. If my finger works well on the dial, we'll work all right. We were invited here by staff of the city and the council to talk about the potential for sustainability in the design of the school building. As part of this work we've been working over the last year with Oak Ridge National Labs, we were able to get a grant to cover the cost of the technical assistance on the geothermal energy system and a little bit, if there was interest, on district energy systems for the particular site. And so we're thankful to the Federal Department of Energy for the support for this work and glad to give it to the city here. What we're really looking at is, should you be considering a high-performance building, I guess is the term I'll use for it, that kind of broadly covers the type of things that you would want to do in the building here to be environmentally sustainable. There's a lot of advantages to being a high-performance building, whether you go to become a net zero energy building or not, including lower environmental impacts, lower operating costs through the years, lower maintenance costs, better resiliency to deal with power outages and other items like that, and natural disasters, and improved energy security. Again, if your building is working using less energy, it has ability to kind of bounce back in when there's been problems. There's three really components to being a high-performance building that we look at. You want to design and construct the building to be to use the least amount of energy that it can. You want to use the most efficient heating and cooling ventilation systems, which we think in this case is a geothermal system. And then when you do it, or sometime into the future, adding solar, photovoltaic, or thermal energy to the systems can get you down to near zero energy in a building, if not all the way there. There are a number of schools that have been built with these systems in the region, including schools in Arlington, in Loudoun, in Alexandria, in the District of Columbia, Prince George's County. So there are plenty of examples of this type of technology being done, and so you will not be out on the leading edge of the technology if you decide to go in this way. As a matter of fact, the first consideration I mentioned is energy efficient building. The ASHRAE, which is the kind of engineering group that sets standards for buildings and particularly commercial buildings, has put out this guide working with other people in the industry on how to design and construct a school building that is 50% more efficient than a standard school building. I think your existing high school measure the amount of energy it's used in something called the Energy Utilization Index, which is kind of a energy use per square foot type of index. Your existing school, I think, is about at a 90 right now. If you were to design a standard school today, you'd be at about between 75 and 80, and we'll show you the numbers of where you'll be if you go to a more efficient school. And the other piece about these types of designs is that most of the people who are in these buildings, the teachers, the faculty, and others, feel like that they work really well. They provide a very good learning environment. You do a little more care on lighting, on air conditioning and heating and ventilation in the buildings, and so the learning environment is considered to be improved. And you also, particularly for our high school, are providing good teachable technologies in the school. So as you're looking at STEM teaching and other types of technologies, you really have a learning lab and a living lab at the building itself. It does require some thoughtful design and planning, that there are trade-offs as you go with a more efficient building. For example, you can have less load on your heating and cooling, so you can go with smaller equipment. And so there's some cost increases and some cost decreases on as you do this. But it does take a thoughtful design as you go through the process to do it because of these interrelations. In this case, I mentioned geothermal is the most efficient heating and cooling system for the buildings. I think most people are probably somewhat familiar with it, but you have wells in the ground that pulls the heat in or pumps the heat out of the ground in the winter and the summer, and uses it to condition the buildings. I mentioned solar as the other one, and again, this could be done either up front or you could design to be able to do it later on in the building. This particular building is the headquarters of Alexandria Renew, the wastewater utility down in Alexandria, but we're showing it because it's a multi-story building along the lines of what you're thinking about building. They've built solar into the awnings over the windows to also help shade and keep the glare down in the buildings, as well as up through and around and on top of the roof. So it just gives you a sense of, you don't need a great big one-story school building spread all out to have a lot of roof space to be able to do this, but you can integrate it into the design in a multi-story building the way you're talking about doing. For this particular project, I'd like to talk a little bit more now about Oak Ridge's feasibility study, again, based upon the work that Oak Ridge has done over about the past year as we've been looking at input from the city staff. The site and feasibility assessment evaluated the engineering and economic feasibility of implementing geothermal at the site. Any final design that you would do would need to have a little bit more work done, as any final design would. They'd need to look at the thermal conductivity of the ground to know how many and how deep wells to drill for the system, and then do all the other types of things that you would do in a building design, looking at the loads and everything and making sure that it fits into the building. The scope of Oak Ridge's study, this preliminary assessment study, looked at this assessment to see whether there was available space on the site to fit the geothermal, to size the major components that would estimate the cost, and evaluate the potential benefits from the work. I mentioned that there's the various stages of the buildings now. That your building is at about 100 or 90 to 100 energy use index. I think it was about 100 if I remember the information from Perkins, Eastman. A standard building would be built at about 80 or so. If you meet the building design guides for the proposed 50% improvement building, you get actually the EUI down to 44, an EUI of 44, and then if you add the ground source heat pump systems in it, you get it down to about a 33 EUI. So again, you're down to about a third of what your school is today if you were to put all of these technologies in place in the building. And then if you were to add solar in later, you could get that down even greater. But I think the key is that you'd be down about a third of what you have now, so your bills would be less, the building would be working better, and you'd have a much, much smaller environmental footprint on the building. This particular slide gets into some of the numbers that they came up with. They sized the building based upon the building being built to that 50% energy design standard. So you size it to be able to cool the building, and so it's in tons of cooling, and so this would be 821 tons in the high school. they looked at the cost of the building compared to the cost of a conventional heating and cooling system. And the initial estimates, they based it upon about a $16 square foot cost for a geothermal system, which they figured was about $375,000 greater than a conventional system in this building. Now, I know the Perkins Eastman work talked about a $1.7 million differential between the heat pump system and a conventional system. After having talked to Perkins Eastman last week, we've gone back and kind of looked at where those numbers came from and looked at their design. They did a hybrid design where they are really, most of the building would have a conventional system and it would have a ground source geothermal system kind of added onto it. And when we look at those hybrid designs, we find that it's really duplicating a fair amount of equipment. And so the cost differential is greater for a hybrid design over a conventional design. You don't get some of the savings that you get in a heat pump geothermal system where you don't have to build as much ductwork. You can, the design differs so that you also get more savings. So our recommendation to you really is that you're facing a decision that you really want to do one or the other, but you don't want to do a hybrid system because of the cost differential in doing a hybrid system. Some people look at a hybrid system because they think it will reduce the risk of failure of your system and make sure that you have your heating and cooling and air conditioning, keep your school open. Again, the technology is developed enough now and we have enough experience in this region and around the country and the world that these systems work well, they work solidly, their maintenance costs are less, although you have to go through the process of teaching your maintenance crews how to work on this different equipment. But once you go through that process, your maintenance costs are less. And so we feel confident that that type of a system can meet your needs here at the school. We also, because there was a price difference between what the folks at Oak Ridge had looked at and what we were hearing from Perkins Eastman, for example, under the conventional system, Oak Ridge estimated one cost and Perkins estimated a number of different costs. Perkins' costs were about 8% higher than what Oak Ridge had estimated. They were using the Means Construction Guide kind of national numbers, and this market is a little bit more expensive than national numbers. So what we did is we took the Oak Ridge numbers and we reworked them a little bit, and we went from $16 a square foot to $18 a square foot, which is a 12% increase in the cost of the geothermal system as a basis of looking at these. Those numbers didn't get up on the slide because we've done that since we sent the slides to you. If we do that and compare that cost to the basic system cost that Perkins Eastman gave you, it's a $600,000 price differential, not $1.7 million. So if you go with a full geothermal system. Then we looked at what the maintenance and energy cost savings would be for the geothermal system. Oak Ridge estimated that at about nearly $49,000 energy cost savings and $108,000 maintenance cost savings. We just lowered that down and rounded it to $150,000 a year cost savings in maintenance and energy, which gives you a 4-year payback if you decide you want to invest in the geothermal system. I know when you're doing school buildings, you don't have a lot of choices where you get to pay back on your investment. This is one that you would have that opportunity to pay back your investment if you decide to include that in the program. So again, we think it's about looking at the tighter numbers for the Northern Virginia market, about a $600,000 price differential and a 4-year payback. So putting that all together, the conclusions again are that, again, we don't think you should do a hybrid system. You need to go one or the other because of the cost differential of doing a hybrid. Geothermal is possible. I've talked about the paybacks. And it has the other benefits of the sustainable building that helps with the education. And then there's a third option that may be too late to consider or not, but there are companies who are willing to come in and finance the cost of these systems, and that you would pay for them as an operational cost and paying for the cost of heating and cooling, the cost of energy that they would deliver, that would take it out of your capital bond issue and turn it into an operating cost, although those can be very complicated deals when you start to layer different types of financing on things. But just to let you know that there are, as we've talked to folks in the industry, they brought that up to us to say that there are companies that have done that and are willing to do that. And that's another option you have to wrestle with the cost differential issues on the system. So finally, if you do decide to go to look at a geothermal system, we would want to have you do what's called the conductivity test that will then give us good data on how many wells we need to drill and how deep they would be. And then you could get the design included in any of the documents that you would go forward with. That's all I had as far as any kind of a presentation. I've tried to be quick and at a fairly high level and be glad to take any questions. And if I can't answer it, I'll ask her to answer it.
Thank you very much. That's very thorough and very very interesting. Do we have questions, comments from council or school board folks? Vice Mayor Connolly?
I think I do have a question. Thank you very much, Steve. We've got the high school and the middle school on this slide, number 9.
Yes, the study did work on look at the middle school also. As I understood it, tonight's kind of what you're considering was really about
Just
the high school. And so really that's all I've talked about. We do have the feasibility study looking at renovation and addition of the middle school, and we'd be glad to cover that at some other time that is appropriate for you.
Okay. And with that third option, that the companies would make this an operating cost and not a capital cost, does that change it changes the equation a bit?
Yes, you'd have to be paying more, because you'd be paying their profit and their cost of borrowing. And so the payback would be longer than 4 years if you go that route. Just like any other type of time that you use a third party to provide a services, then if you do it all yourself and bond it yourself and then operate it yourself, your total cost of ownership will be a little less.
Okay.
But they typically price, the industry typically prices the energy that you would pay for as lower than
Well, yes.
what you would be paying with a conventional system to your local utility.
Right, so your year-to-year operating costs would still be less than with the conventional system.
So they guarantee the lower price, and they also usually guarantee like a 50-year lifespan for the system. So that's takes a little pressure off.
And also, when they have that length of ownership, they're going to keep it up. They're not going to just let the thing run down, since they're going to want to keep it operating as efficiently as possible so that they can meet the rates that they have promised you. And I know with some types of, I'm going to loosely call this a PPA type of arrangement. With some of those, you can get into trouble that they don't keep the system up, and when they turn it over to you at the end, you're getting something that needs a lot of work. When they have a long-term contract, then they really need to keep it up over the life of the equipment.
Other questions? Ms. Hardy?
I just want to make sure I got the numbers right. You mentioned that Perkins Eastman, the reason why their estimate was so high is because they are quoting a hybrid system, and you mentioned that now the technology is such that you don't need to have dual systems and have that duplication. Have all the recent high schools that have done this gone with the single system that is the less expensive one, or are there some that still use the hybrid approach?
The ones that we've looked at, such as, what's the schools in Arlington?
Discovery,
Discovery
Wakefield
Elementary,
and Taylor.
Wakefield High School, and Taylor Elementary all have gone with just the straight geothermal system and not gone the hybrid. Sometimes what they do is they design it for the cooling load, and on the coldest days in the winter, you need a little extra heat, so there'll be a small water heater or boiler in the system. But it's nothing like cooling towers and all the ductwork and the large boilers that you would have in a hybrid system. So sometimes people might call that a hybrid, but it's just, it doesn't look any bigger than a large hot water heater is the heating system, the heating boost that you would have in the system. So those have gone that way. I think the schools in Loudoun have gone with the full geothermal system. Minnie Howard School now has been, golly, that's probably, they've had their geothermal system for 10 or 15 years in Alexandria, and Polk Elementary School all went with the straight geothermal system. And they've used equipment that are commercial heat pump types of system that is a very sophisticated equipment that changes the pressure of the refrigerant and things in it to work efficiently.
Great. I just want to make sure we weren't going to be the guinea pigs. Oh.
No, you will not. This technology has been used, and so we have both the designers and the contractors who can do it right here in this in our area. So we have the experience on both sides of it available.
Back in 1995, when Arlington did their first geothermal system, they did sort of build in more of a backup, almost to a hybrid system, but they don't ever have to use that conventional system. So they feel like that, well, they kind of put this money into this almost hybrid system, but they never use it because
Well.
the geothermal is reliable and
That's true.
enough.
That was 1995,
Yeah,
I guess,
back
when
in
they did that part.
1995,
But the
so-
schools they've done since then, in the elementary school they're designing right now, they're looking at a full geothermal system without the backups.
One more question. And I assume I don't know if it's borings or what you do to check the land, make sure we can support such a system. Has that been done as well?
That's, yes.
Or is that coming up?
And that's the conductivity test, and so they drill one hole, they fix it up to have the pipes down in the hole, and then they run water through it and measure the temperatures to see how much temperature can move in and out of the well hole. So that would be the next step if you're going ahead to finish your design. It's about a $10,000 cost to run the thermal conductivity test. We originally had money in the grant from the feds to be able to do that, but it's taken so long, and with the changes in administration, those funds are not available. We'd be willing to look at some type of a cost share with funds we have at Cog if you want to go ahead with that to help you. We couldn't cover the whole thing, but we would be willing to help you if you're truly interested in going ahead with the system. We don't want to spend a lot of money if it's not going to go to anything, but if you're interested, we'll look at our budget to be able to try and help you. We think that this is a good case study that we can use elsewhere around the region because of everything that you're doing on this site. We have some, but we'd like to be able to get some very good numbers and walk it through the whole thing is why we're willing to put a little money in it ourselves.
Vice Mayor Connolly.
You referenced the EUI as the Energy Use Index. So the standard most people are familiar with is LEED. How do those two compare?
So LEED, on the energy side of things, from LEED Silver on up, requires that the building meet what are called the Energy Star standards, which means it has to be in the top 25% of efficiencies of the buildings. And so there's not a apples to apples comparison here. The 50% design standard that we talked about will get you all of the energy points in the LEED system, but it goes a little farther than what LEED requires for a LEED Silver. As you get into LEED Gold and Platinum, you have additional requirements that kick in, and so some of the other types of things, you can get extra points for some of the types of things you do. But if you build it to the 50% energy standard and then add geothermal, you'll be going farther than the LEED standard. But as we've done some research into the LEED standard and to the 50% standard, they don't provide a one-for-one comparison.
Yes, Mr. Z.
Thank you, Mayor. Hopefully this question won't completely catch you off guard here, but I've got a reputation for coming in from left field, so I don't think it's that far. Thank you for the work that you've done, which has been pretty much centered on the educational facilities, but I'm just wondering with regard to the other economic development piece and the kinds of FAR that we're talking about over three, that what some of your thoughts might be for applicability of this technology for that development as well.
As we began to look a little broadly at the site when we started, and then we've kind of, as you've focused in on the schools, we've focused in on the schools with our work, so it's not quite out from left field, but I'll pay you back when you're the chairman of a committee in front of me here that give you a left field question. No. We began to look at whether or not a kind of district energy system could work at this site. If we think that if you were to go with the geothermal for the middle school, when you do get to doing the renovation, and we think that it is, again, a very good option for that, even if you do an addition onto the middle school and the high school, you've got the space to do the wells. If we were to expand the geothermal alone to the commercial development, we may be running into some space issues there. But you could integrate this into a district energy system and have kind of a mini utility that serves this whole area. And again, that takes some of the capital needs off of your developer's plate and puts it on a third party such as Washington Gas Energy Systems or Dominion Energy Systems or other companies like that. And so as you look at that, and if you have a developer that is interested in that, that is a good option to be able to provide lower cost energy. And if they wish to market the development as a very green development, that is a very good way for them to do that. You can add solar into those types of systems, and you could tie it in with the systems of the school. So that option is available to you, and it really depends a lot on what you as a city would want to see done on that site, and then what the developers would be willing to do.
Let me ask you a question. I saw your numbers. It was in the 40s, I think, for energy savings, but in the 80s for operating and maintenance. I'm just surprised that I would think those numbers would be flipped. Why is it that, I wouldn't even think your operating and maintenance costs would even be that high on a standard system in any given year, let alone the savings. Is that, the numbers you gave us, those are accurate in terms of the energy cost savings are approximately half of your maintenance cost savings.
Yeah, and we looked when we saw those numbers, we looked pretty carefully, and I have some notes here as to where they came from in case somebody asked, and I'm going to look at my notes here. The typical maintenance costs for a school building we took out of the American Society of Heating, Air Conditioning, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, or ASHRAE. And then there was a survey those were 1999 numbers. Then there was a survey done in 2000 of the maintenance costs for commercial geothermal heat pump systems. And so we were looking at those two costs. So one of them was kind of a industry-wide standard cost of maintenance for these types of buildings. And the second one was a survey of actual maintenance costs. And it went from 49 cents per square foot per year to 13 cents per square foot per year in maintenance costs, because this equipment has many, many fewer moving parts. You don't have cooling towers on the roof, so you don't have all the water and water treatment and everything that goes on with the cooling towers. You have fewer pumps. You don't have ductwork around the whole building. You kind of have these individual units that are set up around the whole building, so that there are many, many fewer moving parts with the system. The equipment is very robust. For example, the Mitsubishi equipment at Polk Elementary School just works, and they don't have any problems with it. And so, as we vetted those numbers, they opened our eyes too, and so we went back and vetted where they came from. And so we have this Crane and Garnett survey from 2000, and then the ASHRAE study in 1999 that's based on.
Put
So-
in $2016. So.
Oh,
Yeah.
up
So-
to $2016. I'm sorry, yes. And then the energy savings is a pretty straightforward calculation based upon the efficiencies of the system.
Great, thank you very much. Is there any other questions? Mr. Webb.
When we were talking about the third parties up fronting the cost for the geothermal systems, are there any jurisdictions that you know potentially went that route versus us doing the investment?
I don't know any, and that's why when I was saying it's a complicated process and, you need to look at it. I know that commercial property owners have financed their energy systems as a separate piece from the underlying mortgage. For example, in the district, they're using the PACE financing program for energy systems, and they're kind of layering the types of financing that they're putting together in commercial buildings. But I don't know of any school systems around here that have done that. So if you decided to go down that route, you would be plowing some new ground, yes.
Okay, well, with that, we thank you both again for this great presentation, and we hope to continue this discussion with you all as we get further along the process.
And we're glad to help whenever we can, and I hope this gives you some information that helps with your decision.
Thank you, excellent. We appreciate it. All right, we ready to move on to the next phase?
Can I just note before we leave this item, Kate Walker is here, Tim Stevens. Lauren Bruce, who's not in the room, helped us get the grant. Lauren is here. The work that was done for this study was through a grant that we pursued and got with COG's help, and so it's been a great collaboration to be able to bring this expertise to us, and so we're very grateful for it, and also grateful for the great staff work and getting some outside money to help bring this expertise to us.
Absolutely, great job. And as you heard, Mr. Z is the chair, I guess, of the COG, Council of Governments environmental group for this coming year. So congratulations on that as well. All right, let's move on to the school board referendum ordinance language, shall we?
Okay. Now, the council has a referendum, a draft referendum ordinance that's before you. And Carol McCoskey is right here. I might ask her to come forward and just describe. Yeah, there was a typo in the staff report. If you have the old one, it's not a huge change, and most importantly, the ordinance language itself is the same between the two versions. So.
Yeah, the thing that was changed was at lines 53 and 54, the dates for when this was going to be, when this had to get, when we had to have the court order, and all had not been updated in the original one in the staff report portion. They reflected 2014 dates. So they currently, it's a 20, it reflects the dates for this fall. August 18th, 2017 is when we have to have a signed court order in order to have a valid referendum on November 7th. And I would just say the language essentially is based on what we've used in the past for bond ordinances. Our outside bond counsel has looked it over. We may make a few tweaks to the description of the projects, as the charter requires that they be fairly specific descriptions, but other than that, it's a fairly standard bond referendum ordinance that you would pass, asking the court to order that the question be put before the voters.
Okay. Why don't we just talk a little bit about the actual language, because I think that's really, in some ways, the rub of what this is about. Do you want to just actually read it, or someone read it maybe for the public's?
Sure. So the referendum election to authorize the issuance of bonds to pay the costs of constructing, expanding, reconstructing, renovating, equipping, and/or re-equipping in whole or in part a new or renovated high school and/or middle school, or such other school capital projects have been approved as part of the city's capital improvements program. And the question on the ballot would read: shall the City of Falls Church, Virginia, contract a debt and issue its general obligation bonds in an aggregate principal amount not to exceed, and we need to fill that number in, for the purpose of paying the costs incident to constructing, expanding, reconstructing, renovating, equipping, and/or re-equipping in whole or in part a new or improved high school and/or middle school in the City of Falls Church, or such other school capital projects as have been approved by the City Council as part of the city's capital improvements program, and shall ordinance number blank of the city authorizing the issuance of such bonds be effective. So the ordinance that you would enact would do two things. One, it would authorize this question to be put on the ballot, and that would go to the circuit court, and they would allow that to happen. And then the second important thing that it does is that it authorizes the issuance of those bonds pending the voters' approval of it, if that approval shall be granted.
And the one, it's probably making it a little too complicated, but the one matter is that I had tried to put in some flexibility. We all live through concern about Mount Daniel not having enough flexibility. So the reference to the other school capital projects that have been approved as part of the CIP, that language which gives us flexibility may have to come out simply because of the charter requirements for the specificity and of description of the projects. I'm working with outside bond counsel, but that language may well come out and may just refer to the new high school or middle school.
Okay. Do we have questions, comments? Vice Mayor Conley?
Ms. McCoskey, in the event that this referendum is on the ballot and then passes, how many years do we then have to issue the bonds and do the project?
You have 8 years to issue the bonds, and my understanding is that all the planning is that they would not be issued all at once. They'd be in several different groups up to the total amount that you authorize. But you have 8 years from passage of the referendum to issue the bonds that are authorized.
So that would mean 2025. If it passes in November 2017, we would have till November 2025
To
to
issue
issue
the
all the
full
bonds
amount.
related to this project.
Right.
But we wouldn't have to issue all of the bonds.
That's
We could-
correct. It's
okay.
just gives you authority to do that.
Okay. And is that true for all referendums?
Yes, that's a state code provision that you have 8 years after the referendum is passed.
Okay.
And then you have 3 years extendable somewhat to spend money once the bonds are issued. So in other words, if in year 7 you issued a certain portion of the bonds, those, you would have 3 more years after the issuance to spend them, and you could extend the 3 years.
Okay.
Fairly simply.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Mr. Duncan?
Could I ask, it's been my experience here in town that there are elections that yield referendum verdicts that run counter to the verdicts in the elections for offices for council and school board. So I'm just asking this because let's say that this referendum language goes in as you suggest and it's approved, and yet those individuals who are elected to the city council in that same election, I don't know, they have other ideas than some of us here may have. Is the inclusion of a new or improved high school meant to give that kind of flexibility, or when we go to the voters and explain this, are we telling them first, last, and always we're trying to bond for a new high school?
That language is meant to give some flexibility, and we could just, you could strike the words "or improved," and then you'd be strictly limited in what could be done in the future. But if you had a council in the future who wanted to change what they were doing, they would, they don't have to issue the bonds and do the project in the future in the way that's been approved by the referendum. So it wouldn't, just changing that language wouldn't mean you're guaranteed that a new high school will be built in that form, because a future council could change their mind and get something else approved.
In other words, even if you took out the "or improved,"
Right.
a future council could,
They could decide, we're not going to issue bonds under that authority. We want to go get new authority for an improved high school, a renovated high school, or something else.
okay.
So that is designed to give some flexibility, because the problem always arises that down the road things change, and then you have this authorization and you want to spend it in some way that's slightly different from the language of the referendum.
Okay, so it sounds fairly open-ended. I mean, there have been, again, situations in the past here where, referenda were passed, which basically, on the question of economic development, gave a green light to economic development. And at the same time, individuals were elected to council who did not share that view. And it made for a kind of interesting aftermath, because the voters clearly were conflicted themselves, and the majority voted the green light for economic development referendum, but put people on council who were more yellow light sort of types. And I guess I'm asking, and I think you've told me that this would allow that kind of situation to occur after this November, if we got a referendum yes, and a couple of people were elected to city council on a, or even maybe the school board, I don't know, on a maybe or no.
And I think, yes, that's essentially the answer, that it gives some flexibility. However, I don't think that just narrowing this language and getting the referendum approved would force a future council to do anything anyway. In other words, they
Okay.
would always have the option to sort of turn things around and do something different, even if it involved a new referendum, if that's what they really wanted.
Okay, so that's fine. Thanks for responding to that. So my other question then is about that all-important blank number, whatever it is. If, let's say it's 120 million, and over the course of the next 18 months, it turns out that a new high school, because of land coming in, money coming in for land, because of whatever may emerge in terms of how we're going to finance this, the actual cost of the high school, brand new, is only going to be, pick a number, $75 million. So what this language would enable future councils to do would be to spend $75 million on the new high school, and there would still be, if you advertise $120 million, if you put on the ballot a $120 million number, you'd still have $45 million to bond for other school facilities, other school capital projects.
Well, and that's why I say I believe the language, you would have that money to do the middle school, but I believe that the language, and this is, I was talking to our outside bond counsel about this, I believe that the general language about other school facilities is going to have to come out.
You think that'll drop out?
I
So
believe
even though we
that'll
see
drop
it
out by
here,
next week, yes.
even though we see it here, you think that?
So, yes, because I, having lived mostly through the Mount Daniel problem, try to put in as much flexibility, and then we're looking at the charter, which requires that you specifically describe the project. So I don't think we're going to be able to leave that flexibility in there, and so that will come out for next week.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Hardy?
So on that point, as much as I think I'd like the flexibility because of what happened with Mount Daniel, I think as I can already imagine in the community, people would actually be really hesitant to have such a blank check written for $120 million for any school projects, because I think people want to know that it's going to go towards the high school. And if it's just a general school obligation bond, I think that actually will turn people away from it. So as much as I like that flexibility, I could see why it needs to go. Just to make sure I understand the point, like any other bonds, it sounds like this language authorizes us to issue bonds, but not obligates us.
That's correct.
So we don't have to go ahead with this.
That's correct.
We can go with less, we can go with renovation, we can go with.
And it's an amount not to exceed whatever number you put in there. It's not the full amount or none.
Okay. Thanks.
So, yeah, I agree with the comment relating to other school capital projects. I mean, to me, people who vote for this ought to know what they're getting, what they're voting for, and not just kind of a carte blanche, blank check. And so I have issue, regardless of whether a bond council does, of other capital projects.
Right. Well, that sounds like the prevailing view. So no matter what, that will come out from the words "or such other" in line 168 down to in line 170 after improvements program. It'll pick up again at "and shall ordinance."
I mean, in some ways, the concern is also relating to a new or improved high school, basically, or middle school. You know, it seems like, again, people are voting for a high school, and so you wouldn't want just the middle school, for example, to be done. And so I don't know if there's any finessing to that, but just the concept of, I think people ought to know what they're going to get when they vote for this, and not the possibility that, okay, we actually just did that middle school, we didn't do the high school. And so I don't know if there's any subtlety to that needs to be addressed. But in reading this as a lawyer, I parse these words and I think, well, somebody could just do the middle school, and would that be what someone who votes for this intended to be? And I think the answer is probably no. But anyway, I don't have a great wordsmithing of that, but it's just something that occurred to me. One other thing that also occurred to me, that if in connection with the commercial development, we sought to make infrastructure improvements that we wanted to bond more than $8 million for, we would also need voter authority for that as well. Is that correct?
If they're not part of the high school project, yes.
So, for example, if we wanted to do some kind of infrastructure such as traffic intersections and the like, associated with the commercial development. That may be something as well we might need approval for.
Yes.
Okay. I
Yes.
mean, that's something, we don't know yet what's going to happen. We don't know. Obviously, we'd love for developers to pay for everything. But I think there is a possibility that the city may need to make some improvements to sort of open up this land. It could be transportation. It could be some other kind of utility infrastructure. I don't think we really know right now. But it occurs to me that's a possibility as well. I'm not sure that requires changing this. I would if we wanted a bond for it. But it's something I think to be thinking about in the next couple weeks.
Well, to the extent the city does that as part of the high school project, in other words, if the city puts in roads, et cetera, that work with the high school project, that would be included in this amount.
That's true. Although I guess there's some question about, well, what's, where's the road going?
Right.
What's it being used for? Stormwater, storm pipes, or whatever it is. So anyway, it's just something that occurred to me that we ought to give some thought to. I'm not sure it requires some changes right at this moment, but it's something to think about. Vice Mayor Connolly, did you have something?
I have a question about lines 140 to 142. It says, principal of and interest on the bonds are to be paid from ad valorem taxes on real estate and tangible personal property, or in the city, or as otherwise provided by law. So this allows for the fact that if we do capture the $40 million from economic development, we would be able to pay some of that back?
Capital
Yes.
reserves could be a
Well, they
source of
could-
funding to pay
Yeah.
the principal and interest on the bond.
So that would go, so, or as otherwise provided by law means capital reserves.
It would include that.
Okay.
Let me ask you this precatory language in here, we hereby ordain as follows. What's the purpose of this? Is there a legal purpose for this? For example, the school estimates that the high school is going to cost this amount. What's the necessity of that? For example, I'm looking at line 128 to 130.
There you go.
I would have to double check, but I believe that these findings are required for council to make, that this is, you have to have an estimated cost for the project in order to authorize or to ask the voters to approve the issuance of the bonds. Is that, I'm not sure.
Well, I guess, I mean, when I look at that, a couple of things come to mind. One, that the estimate may be off. Is there any implication if we say the estimate is 118 million, it turns out to be 128? Is there any issue with that?
I don't think so. I think what it is that the estimate needs to be reflected in the amount you ask the voters to authorize. In other words, if the estimate of the cost was 25 million, you ask the voters to authorize 100 million, there might be a problem. But it's simply that you have to be acting based on some information about the actual cost for the project you're looking at.
That sort of also begs the issue about, is the actual use of the proceeds for what you're saying it's for? In other words, what I was just saying a minute ago, well, or could be the middle school or could be the high school. You're right, the language as currently reads says either one of them possibly. But then if you go back to an estimate for the high school, it seems like that would have a conflict as well. In other words, if you have an estimate that high school is going to cost X amount, but your ordinance allows you to use it entirely on a middle school, right, as currently written, and/or.
Right.
I mean, to me, that sort of strikes as a conflict there.
Well, it may be, and if all we're planning to do is just the high school and there isn't going to be any effect on the middle school, that may be what you want to put in there.
Well, but right now, as the language reads, it says or a middle school.
Right,
It doesn't even
right.
require the high school,
Right.
which again sort of goes back to my point. I wonder if we need to finesse this language just a bit more on that. Okay. Other question, Ms. Oliver?
On line 135, the limitations set by Article 7 and Section 10.
Yes.
What are those?
Article, and Wyatt may have this in his head better than I do, but Article 7, Section 10 is that is the statewide limitation on your debt, which is 10% of the total. I believe it's 10% of the total
Assessed value of real
assessed
estate.
value for all property in the city. It's 10%, right? I look it up every time.
And
I'm
Section
sorry.
703?
It's the same. The 703 of the charter essentially reflects what's in the Constitution. 10% of the assessed value of all property in the city.
Other questions? Mr. Duncan?
Following what the Vice Mayor asked, so again, back to line 141, it calls specifically out ad valorem taxes and tangible personal property. You mentioned there that capital reserves would also be an otherwise provided by law funding mechanism, as would any other mechanisms that, might be set up, special development district, TIFs, et cetera, et cetera. We don't specify those not to exclude them, but simply because we
Correct.
don't need to specify them.
That's correct. It's mostly that you're committing your, these taxes as being available to help pay them.
Okay, so it's inclusive in its vagueness,
Yeah.
not meant to exclude anything that would be the will of the current or future councils. And I would just like to go back to what the mayor raised about the language in line 167. So I know we're down to just one lawyer tonight, but since it's a work session format, well, yeah, I mean on our side, sure. You're a given. Okay. If the wording is as it is now, then this could actually turn out to be a referendum which would finance only a middle school.
Yeah, I think one question we probably should have for the school administration is, with the feasibility study, will there be funds spent on the middle school?
Currently, there's no plan to spend any money on the middle school. The only thing that I might suggest is a potential improvement in the language, and I don't know how to do this, subtly or in a nuanced way, is that being the new person in the room, it's always been referred to as the George Mason, Mary Ellen Henderson site. So perhaps there's a way to incorporate some language in there about it, in the improvements on the site, as opposed to specifically a high school or the middle.
And I think that's where we have a problem with the charter requiring that
Okay.
we reference the projects we're actually doing. And when we put this together, I wasn't certain how much or of which project, and if it's solely the high school project is going to be the total amount for this, we could say that. But I didn't know at the time, with the blanks not filled in, whether they would reflect both the high school and the middle school.
What, there is a tie.
I was just trying to say that the tie-in to the middle school is that the way that Community One is right now designed, there's going to be an attachment. The two schools would be shared, at least in the kitchen facilities.
Okay, I appreciate that discussion. Maybe that's the area that I'm headed towards, but what if the language just said a new high school and improved middle school? I mean, my impression of what we were talking about here is a new high school and an improved middle school. At some point, not in the too dark distant past, there was the rumor about that we were going to tear Maryland Henderson down and rebuild it. I mean, I know that was dismissed, but at election time, outlandish things get up and walk around. And so I'm trying to, hit language here that says what I think it is that we're talking about doing, which is a new high school and a tie-in to the middle school, which is, it's an improvement. It's a connection to it. It's not a new middle school.
Why don't we let the city attorney finesse
Okay,
this? I think she's heard our comments
Okay,
and
fine.
I imagine understands them. Ms. Hardy?
I was just going to say, in the interest of time, could we circulate that early this week?
Okay.
Okay, are there any other comments? Ms. Hardy?
So, going back to the blank spaces, I know that we have a lot of placeholders for what the fiscal impact is once we fill in the numbers. Again, reading more as a taxpayer and a voter, I think I'd want to know how this translates in terms of tax rate increases and in what increments and what period of time. Are we going to be able to provide that in the staff report or all the voter education leading up to this?
We're going to provide that in about 5 minutes.
Perfect.
At least notional.
Okay, anything else? Let's move on then. Why don't we to the
Okay.
next portion of the presentation?
All right. Well, let me invite Kieran Bawa up to the table. We're joined by Joe Mason with Davenport as well. And Joe, I think you could come as well. We wanted him to be here partly just to listen to the discussion, but also to provide an independent view. and his colleague, Jen Dirksen, with Davenport, is with us as well. So Kieran is passing out a PowerPoint. Maybe you can send them that way. And the goal of tonight's presentation is to provide all the numbers in the CIP in terms of what the debt financing plan would be. We have on tonight's agenda a draft CIP ordinance, and so the request ultimately is for the council to place on the agenda for June 26th a CIP ordinance for first reading, and then adopt a revised CIP in July. And that could either be, in the way it's cast in your packet, is the CIP that you adopted on April 24th plus the school. And we've priced it and we've modeled it at $120 million based on the feasibility study and based on Dr. Noonan's memo. In addition to that, then we'll propose a modified CIP that I mentioned earlier. And the whole premise behind that modified CIP is to place some of the projects so that they are aligned with when we actually receive the money for the economic development on the campus and when we have some natural step downs in our debt service. In a sense, it's a smoothing from a financial perspective. We recognize that this is a disruptive discussion. A great deal of thought and effort has gone into our capital planning, and so any idea of cracking it open and moving projects around is a disruptive discussion. There's no question about it. But what we're asking everybody to do is to put on their fiduciary hats and really think about what kind of financial risk we're willing to take on, and how we're running the finances of the city over the long term. Even with the modified CIP, as we'll see, it is an extraordinary amount of debt in the short term. And there are long-term consequences to that as we pay the debt service over many years to come. So that's an introduction. Again, the desire for this discussion is to get council direction for changes potentially to the capital improvements program that then you would take action on first reading on June 26th. We would also have opportunities for more public input through the month of July before it then was acted on July 24th as the schedule that's been laid out. So let me turn it over to Kieran, and I'll just say as by way of introduction, as we have presented this to the Budget and Finance Committee on Friday. We did make some modifications to it based on some suggestions from that. And we're finishing it up today amidst power outage and things like that. And Kieran went through that always with a good spirit, but we're pleased to make this presentation tonight and look forward to a very deep and important discussion with the council tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Director of Finance, do you want me to sit or? Okay, that's better. So we have before you a discussion on what a full CIP model looks like and what amendments that we are proposing, and that discussion would go through. And per your direction today, after the amendments that you would like to see, there will be a first reading to the ordinance, the CIP amendment ordinance, on June 26th, and a second hearing on July 24th, prior to the filing of the bond referendum in August. So starting with a little bit of current picture, the city's current debt is a little over 51 million, and the debt service that we assume annually is 6.2 million, which is roughly 8% of the city's operating budget, which relates to 16 cents on the real estate tax bill. This is just laying down things as they are now. The ratio of the miscellaneous general government debt to schools is about 28% to 72%. Recently, the school conducted a feasibility study, and the results were received last week. And based on that, the school board has recommended and provided us a recommendation for this project to be included in the CIP. Their estimated cost from the administration after addressing the mitigation efforts is $117 million. That, along with the financing costs, requires a debt of $120 million for this project. So this is where the amended full CIP kind of looks like, with the adopted CIP of $33 million, including issuance costs. The George Mason High School estimated at $120 million, and Thomas Jefferson Elementary School estimated at $15 million, for a total debt of $167.5 million. The picture on the right, the graph on the right, shows the ratio of the current debt of $51 million and how we're about to grow it multifold to a little over $218 million. Project more. So here, this picture graph shows you a list of all the CIP projects. So this blue color is the current debt as it stands, and you'll see that after there is a drop in the mid 25-26 fiscal years, then further drop, and then it tapers out. If we were to stay with the current debt, these are the notches where it comes down. The purple is the miscellaneous general government debt. That's debt service. This is all debt service. So debt service that is assumed based on the fiscal year 2018 CIP that has been adopted. The light purple is the $4 million that was adopted in the fiscal year 2018 CIP for the park land acquisition project. The pink is the debt service for the City Hall renovation public safety project. The light green is the debt service for the library renovation. This level debt in red color is for the George Mason High School, and the orange is the Thomas Jefferson Elementary School, and this light blue is assuming future debt service in out years of $5 million in every other year. The idea of, and then the purple bar is the city's 12% debt to expenditure policy ratio. That's kind of graphed here. This is the full CIP picture with the timing of the projects as we need it. Pretty much all projects per the CIP, adding the schools and the TJ, both the schools, would make the full CIP debt service to be this. Any questions? I can stop. Otherwise, I'll carry on.
Just one. So 7 years then is the number of, if I count the bars right,
Exactly.
the number of years that we would be above.
Over the policy.
Above the 12% number.
Exactly.
And at the peak, what would the percentage?
It's about 17%, 16.9% in the highest year. So here, the black triangles show that after addressing using the 10 million reserve that we have in capital, this will be the burden to the general fund. So essentially, we could be relieved of this much using the reserves, and this would be the deviation off the policy using the 10 million reserve that we have. Say that again, sorry.
When you, the 10 million is, that's been agreed upon that we would do that, right? I mean, that wouldn't be anything
sure.
new. Okay.
But despite that,
I guess I'm just wondering why, if that's baked in, why not bake it in? To
Well,
your-
I
to
think
your bar graph?
the real debt service is the bars that are shown. The impact on the general fund is represented by the triangles. And so both need to be seen and be understood. And it's particularly important when you look at the next slide, when we consider how land sales then, if they're used in reserves in a similar fashion, the impact that they have.
I should let you finish.
So now these triangles show the impact to the general fund, assuming a 40 million land sale proceeds and the 10 million in reserve. So if with the 50 million capital reserve, this is where the true impact to the general fund would be, which is below the policy. But high reliance on the, sorry, were you saying something?
So my question at this point is, you've included the $10 million left over from the water sale to arrive at this new set of triangles here. It assumes also the off-taking of the land at 40 million. And so my first question is, does that assume that the land is taken down at, well, maybe you can just tell me what rate that's taken down. It's all 40 million right away?
So we're assuming 15 million in fiscal year 22, 15 million in fiscal year 24, and the remaining balance in fiscal year 26.
And what's the impact on our capital reserve at that point after we've spent the 10 million? How much will we have left?
So the impact on the capital reserve is directly proportional to how we set, or the impact on the tax, the real estate tax increment. And based on that, the idea is in all this to keep a minimum reserve of 3 million per the policy.
3 million?
3 million.
So our minimum, when we model this out, the minimum balance in the capital reserves is 3 million.
Is that out of the water money or out of the larger unassigned reserve?
Well, all the money there now is out of the water, and so you put in the payments that Karen just described, and those get paid out over time to bring down your debt service, but you never draw it down below 3 million is the way we've modeled it, so it stays within that policy guideline.
Why would you do that?
That's
I'm not trying to sound threatening. I'm just.
Well, there's two
I thought the
reasons.
$10 million was earmarked for the schools, and
Right.
you're saying that it would actually be $7 million.
That's correct. But when you look at the particularly with the land sale option, where we do rely on the timing of those payments, maintaining some reserves for contingencies just for that plan is something that we think would be a good idea.
But again, here you do not, in anything you're going to model, I know, going to show touching the unassigned fund balance, which is going to remain at or near peak of policy.
It will remain at the target, at the policy target.
17.
Okay, so
That's right, and that's 14 million in today's dollars. Yeah.
we have $14 million, and so then you would keep an additional 3 instead of spending all 10.
That's right.
Okay. I don't, of course, endorse that, but I understand it.
That's right. Understood.
Can you send, so that I don't miswrite some of these things, can you send out those assumptions and the various things that you mentioned with regard to when we realize proceeds of the land and when you intend to start drawing on reserves and how much we would have left? Can you just put that in an email message
Sure.
in next day or so?
I was actually going to ask whether we could have that spreadsheet that showed kind of exactly when we were dipping into reserves. It was like, it showed by year and then the tax rate changes. Do you remember the modeling that we had done?
Yeah, these are, the model is pretty easy. It's very busy, but you can print out 11 by 17 pages of it and you see exactly how the money flows based on these assumptions. We've tried to simplify it down, for the purpose of this presentation.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think the takeaway here is that you've done a lot of work to show that it's possible to have, based on your model here and based on the economy remaining where it is, and a few other assumptions that that we can take on this arguably very impressive debt load and still make it work. But my fear is that when I'm asked that question of what you've just presented here, that without any other foundation, I won't be able to explain what it is that you've portrayed here, and that would be, I think, irresponsible. So I would like to have that information.
Well, we've got a couple more slides, so let's go through those, because this is a measure of, what the absolute dollars would be in terms of debt service, with the 12% of policy as one metric. The other is, what are the pennies on the tax rate, or what's the impact on your average homeowner, and we'll get to that in just a moment.
Why, before we move off of this, just so make sure I understand these two charts. So the debts are, we still have the debt. Like I think that the chart might be a little misleading. It doesn't reduce our debt because we still have that same amount of debt. We'd still be exceeding the 12% policy limit. What those little triangles are showing is the impact of the general fund. So
That's right.
I think by overlaying the two could potentially be misleading to the public by saying if we, use reserves and we use a land transaction of some sort, then we're not exceeding policy. And I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think from an outside person that would be looking at this, they would say your debt service is 18 million and you're exceeding your policy. And so there's a narrative that goes with that about how the land sale and how the capital reserves are mitigating the impact on the general fund. And that debt service as a ratio of your overall budget is a measure of resilience. It's a measure of budgetary flexibility. And so the fact that the reserves are being used in that way, A, will raise eyebrows because we're using reserves in that way. But B, if there is the fact of it that does protect the general fund, and for the years that those reserves are able to be deployed in this fashion. The big issue here, though, is that we're relying on a third party to provide us with the lion's share of those capital reserves, and so the real decision point is how much risk are you willing to take on before you know that's a certainty, and I think that's a key issue.
Vice Mayor Conley.
So I have two questions here. Before we sold the water system, did we have capital reserves at all?
No.
We did not. So this has allowed us to have capital reserves.
Correct.
Okay. So what we do with that $3 million, that'll be another conversation.
Right.
My other thought, though, related to those triangles is, so if the market changes, if we don't get $40 million for the sale of the land, then those, the limit on those triangles moves as well. So this is in the best case scenario, if what was modeled last week works, it looks like that. If it doesn't work, then it could look like the previous slide. Because this is with what we have right now.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So let me ask, I got a question or two relating to that. So would you propose then when this 40 million comes in and over a period of 6 years or whatever it was you just said, would that be an interest reserve essentially being held and paid out to defray the cost of the payments, or would that be a defeasement of the bonds? Like in other words, we'd set up the bonds so they could be defeased.
Does anybody else want to?
Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I do. So I would think that the idea is to hold that money to use it towards our debt service and use the reserves for that. And Joe, you want to add to it?
Yeah, going back a year or two, we looked at this both ways, whether it's better to buy down the amount of debt that you borrow or keep it as a cash reserve and use it to defray the cost of the debt service. Mathematically, it works out in your favor to keep the reserve and pay debt service over time, both mathematically and just philosophically, having some cash in the bank to help deal with this level of debt service, we think gives a little more comfort overall.
So I'm not sure I fully understand that. So the money we have, like if we had $40 million, to my knowledge, we'd be getting less than 1% return on that money. I think currently we get less than 1% on our $25 million or whatever we have basically in the bank or the VML funds that we can use. Right? Is that sort of your assumption that we'd still be getting less than 1% of that $40 million?
Currently, yeah.
and then we'd be paying out our bond over 30 years, for example, would probably be close to 4%, maybe. Does that seem like a reasonable expectation?
4%, yeah.
So how is it that would be good? I'm just trying to understand. Like, we're basically be carrying money that might take 5 years or whatever to use, but it's just sort of sitting there almost fallow. How is it that would be good use of funds?
Let me rephrase what I said earlier. I take your point. I left out an element. From a budgetary cash flow point of view, you're better off using the capital reserve to mitigate the otherwise fairly sizable impact on the real estate tax rate. So you're correct, avoiding interest for 30 years by buying down the debt initially with the upfront land sale proceeds. If it could be done efficiently in the public markets, you might save more in interest, but in terms of getting through the peak years of the debt service when it's ramping up like that, having the capital reserve allows you to better manage that peak debt flow. That's maybe a better way of saying it.
I guess for me, I'd like to see that analysis. In other words, what the cost is. Like, you're sort of making a value judgment in some ways that it's better to buy down your real estate rate. But to me, I'd like to see the numbers to say, okay, well, this is what we lose every year. Or holding this money would take this many years to bleed down as an interest reserve. We would lose, $5 million, let's say, in interest we have to pay out that we wouldn't have to pay out if we actually paid down the debt at an earlier point. Do you understand sort of what I'm looking for? Is just, to me, it may be right what you've just said, but I can't really do an analysis of that without knowing the numbers.
Certainly, and it wasn't intended to be a value judgment. I mean, I don't make policy around here, you folks do. So, I mean, we can collectively put our heads together and show it to you both ways, but we did do that previously, and we could certainly update that analysis.
I think it'd be good just to see the number, that in other words, if we had $40 million, this is what our expected return is based on our current return, and this is what we estimate the interest we'd have to pay on that money. And so there's a delta, but it's kind of a negative delta, right, than if we put it to use. And so to me, we ought to be doing that kind of analysis.
Yeah, and that's, we can certainly do that. And we ought to be very straightforward about what we're doing here. We're using one-time money, and it's a total of $50 million, to smooth out the peak on this debt service. So that $50 million is going to all be used in a relatively short period of time, about 10 to 12 years. What you're proposing is that that $50 million be used over 30 years, because that's what happens if you use it to avoid issuing the debt. And so the impact of it is much stronger in terms of smoothing the peak, used this way, as opposed to buying down the debt. And the only reason we're considering doing it this way is because this is such an extraordinary project.
I got it, and that may be the right answer ultimately, but I think people ought to know what the analysis is. In other words, we're going to spend another $7 million as a city or lose $7 million in value to do this thing. Is it worth it to smooth things out, this amount of money that we could pay for a library or something with? So I don't know what the numbers are, but I know the city doesn't get a whole lot of interest on the money that we keep in the bank, and keeping money in the bank for 5 to 10 years of that kind of magnitude could be a significant amount of money.
I think part of that analysis needs to show the appetite for that tax rate increase. So if we use that $50 million to buy down the debt instead of using it for debt service, what would the tax rate need to be in order to pay that debt service that otherwise would have been paid for by the capital reserve? So I think that analysis needs to show that kind of comparison so that we can figure out, does the community have that kind of appetite that we may save in the long run because we're paying less interest on the overall amount of debt because we've bought down the amount of debt. But it means a short term, the tax rate increase needs to be much higher because you're not using reserves to pay debt service.
You'll actually see a
Yeah,
little bit of that
and
here on
yeah,
the next
you're
slide
gonna
or two.
And I was just going to say that we haven't gotten to the assumptions behind this yet, and I think it's very important that we understand that what the city manager is proposing that we do is that we change from our typical financing of 20-year level principal to 30-year level debt, which is going to raise the interest rate, the interest cost to the city significantly over that time. And up front, we will be paying mostly interest.
I think one other piece of information would be helpful to me is to know the cost of getting a defeasible or partially defeasible bond. So in other words, if we decided to put that money in there, in other words, we just bonded $120 million. Wow, we just got $50 million for our land. We want to basically pay that off. What are the costs associated with doing that? In other words, I know there's costs associated with making a bond either fully or partially defeasible. And I guess You can either tell us now or just tell us later, but if we could get those numbers at some point, I think that would help in the analysis as well.
Absolutely. And I can go back and get you a more precise figure, but what you're asking for is an extraordinary call feature. In other words, you get a sum of money in at some point prior to the normal 10-year call period, which you could normally call your bonds, to tell investors that you're going to possibly call their bonds in earlier and thus take out some of their income. You're going to pay a little more for that. And last I checked, it was in the 20 to 25 basis point range to do that. We did something very similar with National Public Radio a few years ago. They wanted to do a capital campaign as part of their new building, and I don't know that the capital campaign ever worked out, but we did, I think, use the extraordinary call for another purpose. So it was money well spent. So
That's a quarter point, basically, in interest rate. Okay, that doesn't seem to me to be extraordinary amount for some
it's
flexibility.
not huge. It's not, I mean, it fluctuates a bit, but it's not huge.
Okay.
So if that's the route you want to go, that can certainly be done.
Well, I mean, I think given what happened to Mount Daniel as well, just this idea of that gives us some flexibility to move money around potentially for different uses, and as money comes in that we may not have expected. Anyway, I think I like having the flexibility to pay off some debt if we decided to. But anyway, maybe continue on with your presentation.
Okay, so as Councilmember Oliver said, here are some assumptions that go beyond the behind this full CIP model, and that is to issue a 30-year level debt for the George Mason High School phased approach, phased over 3 years, fiscal year 18, 19, and 20. City Hall, 11.7 million, including the issuance cost, a level principal in fiscal year 18. Other CIP projects, including all the 2018 adopted budget projects at 11.8 million level principal. Thomas Jefferson Elementary School at 15.3 with level principal, as well as the library. All these assume interest rates phased from 3.5% to 5% over the next 4 or 5 years during the phasing. Question?
That reflects what we passed April 24th.
Yes.
We
And
didn't
the
do a
other
TJ, did we?
CIP, except the schools. That's the amendment that we're bringing forward.
Was the library FY19 on April 24th?
Yes,
Okay, so everything's the same,
yes,
except we've added.
the schools. So here, this slide shows the impact of this full CIP on the real estate tax, and as well as equivalent on the homeowner per bill. With the land sales, as you'll see in the red line, it starts with a 9 cents increase, and then with the land sale proceeds coming in, it'll decrease over the next few years, go down and steady out at 5 cents. With the one without the land sales, that includes the use of the 10 million reserve portion of it, and that starts out right away at 13 cents, peaks at 17 cents, and then as the total debt wears out over the years, then it starts coming down. Both of these include the use of the capital reserve, the current capital reserve of 10 million. The pension investment savings could have an impact of about a cent and a half, and also the 1.5 cent that got adopted in the fiscal year 18 budget as part of the capital piece. Both are reflected in these numbers. So
All the 10 million or 7 of the 10?
a portion of the 10, yes, 7.
Okay, so
So
7.
just by policy, trying to maintain a balance of 3 million in the reserve, capital reserve. That's the idea.
I guess what I don't know is, do we have a policy to retain a certain percentage of capital reserves? And maybe we do, and I just don't know it. So what is that policy?
We do. That was in the existing fiscal policies, which we reaffirmed.
So
You
our
approved
policy
that.
is to retain 30% of existing capital reserves in any given year.
3 million
No, a $3 million
minimum.
minimum.
Oh, our policy is to maintain a $3 million minimum.
The policy is meant to have a $3 million capital reserves that gets deployed in your capital improvements program, and you have pennies on the tax rate that are built in to replenish it. So you have sort of steady state, pay-as-you-go capital, pay-as-you-go in addition to debt.
Yeah, my recollection of the way that came to be was that we were going to build it up to $3 million because we wanted to have $3 million. Right. But not that that was, if
But
we.
I will submit, sort of in the context of a $218 million CIP, in the context of a $218 million CIP, the $3 million is not really the hugest decision point. I mean, it's relevant, but
Okay.
it's not a huge driver in moving any of these
You'll
numbers.
argue that, I mean, you do argue that it's appropriate, and you argue
We're-
it's not
right.
necessarily that big a deal.
Yeah, I mean, you can change that assumption, and the numbers would change very slightly. But one thing that I would like to
again, you know, when we were trying to get to that $3 million, it was like, you know what, we don't have any capital reserves at all, and we were really hurting. And then we designated $10 million for capital reserves, and that was a big policy decision. We could have spent that money on any number of other things. So we created a capital reserve that was more than 3 times greater than anything that we had ever had before.
Right.
And so I guess we're looking at that $10 million number through the lens of, you know, a kind of backwards focused lens to me. But okay, it's not that important to go into further now.
Before we move on, all right, we've got 2 down here. Let's go, Ms. Oliver, then Ms. Hardy, and then I'll have.
I just, while we're on the subject of fiscal policy, I just want to also point out that the level debt assumption, 30-year level debt assumption, puts stress on our abilities to meet our currently adopted financial policies, the ones that we just readopted earlier this spring.
Ms. Hardy, Mr. Z, and me.
I think we talked about this previously, but I think another assumption behind slide 10 is this assumes that operating budgets are fully funded by revenue growth, and so that there's no sense
Yeah, this
here
is
for
this is strictly a capital planning discussion. So this assumes that operating budgets are just paid for out of operating revenues, and there's no tax rate increases required for operations.
And this is also just, I assume, best case. So this assumes we either get the land transaction or we don't. This assumes that the projects are coming in at cost, is what we estimate now. So this is best case. I know this is probably a good segue for next, but I'd like to see the stress case version of this. Like, if those things don't happen, how high could tax rates jump?
Well, I think this does lay that out. So the blue line is that's the scenario where the land transaction doesn't happen. And it so here's just a couple things on this slide. One, let's a little bit of good news that all of those, every one of those pennies on the tax rates that's labeled in here, they would all be 3 cents higher were it not for 2 really important actions that the council took. And one is to invest some set of the sale proceeds in the pension fund to return a perpetual return on equity for the taxpayers. So that's $0.015 that is reflected here, and then the $0.015 that you adopted last spring. So that 9 cents that you need to enact next March, and just so we're all clear, what the CIP stands for, in order to be feasible, it requires a 9-cent increase in the tax rate next March. And then that holds steady, and then as the land sale proceeds come online, there's potentially room to reduce that. If the land sale proceeds do not occur, then we get we start at 13, or if there's a decision that we weren't going to do the land sale as part of the development of the high school, then we would need to do 13 cents next March, with anticipation by FY22 that would go up to 17 cents.
And also to note that you could start with 9 cents, assuming the land sales is going to happen, and then later on decide that it's not going to happen. Then the delta is going to be, the impact is going to be more to catch up for this loss.
Yeah.
So if you start here and then this doesn't happen, you're going further up. The impact is higher.
And we didn't present that slide just because it gets complicated. And so this is a fairly simple look at with land sales and without land sales. And really what this drives home is that the strategy of having some land that would go up to 10 acres on the campus is very powerful in terms of making this project, the high school project and the full CIP feasible. But there's a lot of risk to it because we can't control that. We can set good conditions for it to happen, but at the end of the day, we can't control it. And that's really the driver. I'm going to take just the next two slides and then turn it back to Kieran. So why would we modify the CIP? And so the thinking is that to lessen some of the impact on the taxpayers, the impact of the general fund, and the risk, the sort of the special risk that's associated with the reliance on the land sale proceeds, is that we realign the projects with timing of the land sale proceeds. And so let's get the money in hand before we take on all of the debt in the CIP. And we also benefit from some drop downs in current debt service that occur about that same time. 21-22 is when we have a $1.2 million drop down and then a bigger drop down in 25-26. So a couple of things that we've laid out in the modified CIP. And what it really comes down to is taking $29 million worth of the projects in the CIP and realigning them later and out years based on those two big events, the land sale proceeds and the drop down in debt. So what does that mean? So the high school stays essentially on track because you can't get the sale proceeds unless the high school project proceeds. City Hall, we've modeled also staying on track. And the rationale for that is that we've already issued the first tranche of debt for that project, and we're already in the procurement process for that. So it's, and that in addition to the public safety driver for that project.
Wyatt, how much has been issued?
$5.2 million has been issued. So the other CIP projects, we would specifically the $4 million for land acquisition and the $1.1 million for turf, those would be pushed out. TJ Elementary School would be pushed out to 2025. The library would be pushed out to 2025 and also increased. If you push it out, we're using a 5% annual escalation in the cost. And so there's a cost to pushing any project out, and that the inflation right now in the construction markets, the inflation is higher than natural inflation. TJ, we've kept at 15.3 simply because that was the high end of the number that we were provided, so we thought that it's possible that we just keep that high end number, but we still move it out. All of these are, you can argue with all of these, but I wanted to bring a model to you that would be more closely aligned with the events that we're counting on and de-risk the CIP to a certain extent. So now I'll turn it back over to Kieran to walk us through the rest of what that looks like.
Ask one question. You're showing the high school issuing all 120 million in 2018?
No, it's the same assumption, and it probably should be footnoted here, but so it's the same phased approach that we did in the last. So there's no difference on the high school project between this and the full CIP.
Okay, and just because it's not in the presentation, what is the phasing on that?
It's, it's a 3-year, 60%, 20%, 20%, starting in fiscal year 18 issuance.
Let me repeat my call that you commit these numbers in a form that we can be shared among us.
Sure.
I don't trust my recollection. I don't like writing in the dark.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think we appreciate the digested version, but I think having seen the detailed model before, I think this council has appetite to see the details.
Okay.
I did have some other questions, though. I didn't want to cut Mr. Z off.
Thank you. Also, what is your assumption on the tax rate, real estate tax rate? That would increase at a fixed amount per year. Is there also an assumption on increasing revenue to be gained from other areas such as commercial or sales tax? Are those assumptions also built in?
Any increases that happen to our revenues are assumed to go to operating. So that's just a big assumption that's built into this model. We isolate operating, we put it over here, and we're just looking at the cost of debt service. Now you can say that's too simplistic, but for the purpose of understanding these capital decisions, that's what we've done.
Was it like a 2.5%?
Yeah, so we do assume an increase in assessed value of 2.5% per year. Now, that is what's happened in the last 10 years, and we've had economic development in the last 10 years, but that's been the average year-over-year increase in AV in the city of Falls Church for the past 10 years. It also includes a recession in there as well. But the way that factors into this model is, A, it has an impact on what a penny on the tax rate generates, and then it affects the slope of that 12% line. That's really the only two ways that that 2.5% assumption operates in this model.
Is now a good time to talk about TJ while we're here? Okay. So I appreciated the memo, Dr. Noonan, that you sent that kind of explained the rationale of how we were planning capacity across the schools. I think in the memo, I saw that we were estimating 20 classrooms would be $10.5 million. Is this 15 million number just the escalation for the future cost of it, or is it additional expansions? Or
As I understand it, that 15 is the escalated cost. So if we did it now, it probably would be closer to the $10.5–11 million range.
Okay. So my question is actually on some of the common spaces. So if we were to keep 4 grades at TJ, do we think that the current cafeteria and the gym and all the kind of common spaces wouldn't need to be expanded? I just worry that adding 10 or 20 classrooms wouldn't be enough, that we would have other costs there too.
That's a great question. In the feasibility study that we've taken a look at from Luke Meyer, there are some expansions in those common spaces also accounted for. So it's classroom space and cafeteria.
Okay, good. And are we okay with waiting till 2025 for that, I guess, in this modified CIP version?
I think it's going to be tight. I mean, in all honesty, as I look at these numbers that are part of your package, and I look at the number at Mount Daniel at 2526, if we were to keep the K1-2 students there, that puts us over the 660 cap by about 24 kids. So if we were to create some sort of program that perhaps was a combined 2-3 classroom over at Thomas Jefferson, that could bump that number at TJ in 2526 to about 790, almost 800, which is about where we are now. So we could move some students around in that 24, 25, 26 timeline. But I think that developing programs at that point gets a bit problematic, particularly if there is a new building on the horizon, because when you wind programs in, to unwind them afterwards becomes complicated.
Yeah. And what's not on here that I also read in the memo, that I hate to throw another school in there, is I think there was thinking that by 2025 MEH might need to grow as well.
That's correct.
And so if we're thinking 12 million for the library, we're going to have that conflict, and we're going to need to know how much more room do we have for that kind of debt to take on if we need to grow MEH there. So I want to make sure we just have that full picture, not just look 5 years out, but longer than that, because we will have other needs, and I'd hate for things to keep getting punted, and then we'll have to deconflict them again later on.
Sure.
Vice Mayor Conley, then Mr. Duncan, then Mr. Z. Sorry, Mr. Z.
In this modified CIP, you have the library in 2025. How does that, you just told me that we have 8 years to issue bonds on projects, but the library bond passed in 2016. Will we have to have a new referendum?
Well,
because it's $12 million?
The debt service shows up in that year, so the debt would be issued the year prior.
Okay, so it would be within that
So
8-year
it's
cap.
right on the edge, and right.
But we only have a bond for $10 million, $9 million?
8.7.
8.7,
Yeah.
but now we're going to need 12.
Yeah,
So what will we do?
So I think we would need to go back. Under this modified, we would need to go back. I think we'd essentially need to start over on the library.
Start over.
And that's as I said at the beginning, this is a very disruptive discussion that we're having.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but I'm not sure if we actually paid, quote, cash for the remainder, we would need to go back.
That's an excellent point. Absolutely correct.
All right, Mr. Duncan, then Mr. Z.
Well, I wanted to ask a little bit about the library, but you pretty well summed it up there. So in this model here, basically you just scrap the library plans and start over. Are your elements of the library that are represented now as having reached end of life factored into your operating expenses somehow? I mean, I get in the elevator and it, drops half a floor. I mean, would you conceive that the library would be worked on between now and 2024 in some way, and the cost associated with that
It would need to be, yes.
would need to be factored into? And
they-
we don't really
those-
have any idea what that cost would
Those
be.
costs have not been factored in.
Okay.
Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. Can you tell us what significant other projects might be left in the other CIP? For example, the cost share on the police shooting range and a few other things of high interest.
Do you want to listen?
Sure. So the two projects that are put out for the out years, one is the 1.1 million for the Larry Graves turf and 4 million for the park land acquisition. All the other projects, like the fire shooting range and all the other projects, are in the 6.5 million.
But what are the other projects?
Oh, you want to know the list of the projects? So the shooting range at 1.2 million and 100,000 for roadbed reconstruction. There is a little less than $1 million for Mount Daniel, 935,000. There is 219,000 for general fund equipment, essentially vehicles. 200,000 for fire station in fiscal year 18, and 250,000 for voting equipment.
So the Mount Daniel is what was approved last 2 months ago, and so that gets issued next year.
What and my follow-up question is, what would the impact of? I mean, what sort of planning have you done for other CIP needs that would come after this tranche, however it works out? Does that? I mean, I'm thinking of just going forward. There's nothing.
What we've assumed is there's $5 million worth of debt needed every other year in the years after the 5-year planning period.
So there is some flexibility, and this assumption of 5 every other year. Can you just sort of enumerate the kinds of things that you were thinking of spending that kind of money on?
Well, what did I just do here?
Where do you want to go? Oh.
So once you get, well, the CIP basically is all, there's no other debt that's planned that has not been identified in the 5-year CIP until we get out to the year 2026, when we start that 5 million every other year, just as a modeling construct. So those projects have not been identified, but they would be things like all of the other municipal facilities that we have.
Okay.
Or the Larry Graves Field or the park or whatever. I mean, if you're deferring those would go back into the hopper to be
That's right.
considered once you have
Yeah,
the gates open on the new 5-year, or on the new 5 million.
that's right.
Okay, other comments, questions?
So we'll just chart out what that modified CIP would look like in terms of annual debt service, and then a couple of the metrics that we use to analyze the risk, and I think that we have a few more slides in the presentation, I guess is what I'm saying.
So this slide shows the chart out of the modified CIP debt service. You'll notice there are 5 years with much reduced dependence past the reliance, past the debt to expenditure policy. And the highest year is as much as 14.1%. And here are the triangles. This is the impact to general fund with no land sales, just assuming that the 10 million that we have, or the 7 that you'd like to say, that we have to rely on would reduce, and we would be in compliance with the debt to expenditure policy as far as the impact on the general fund is concerned with that reserve, with the use of that reserve.
And would this be at 12% or 17% as far as basically our unassigned fund balance? What number are you using?
So
Yeah, it's at our target at 17%.
17, okay.
And then this is to show that the impact to general fund should we receive the 40 million in land sale proceeds along with the current reserve that we have. We'd be well within the policy. So the next chart shows the impact, the tax impact with this revised model. And it starts out with 4 cents with assuming the land sale proceeds. 4 cents reduces down to 2, and once the proceeds are consumed, goes to 9 and steadies there. However, without the land sale proceeds, immediate start out would be an impact of 7 cents, peaking up at 13 cents in another 10 years in fiscal year 2028. And like the previous chart, this assumes that there is the 1.5 cent and the one of each from the capital that was adopted in fiscal year 18, the increase, as well as the return from the pension investments. So a reduction of total 3 cents starting in. So if we were to go with this model, it means a 4 cent increase, assuming the land sales for next year's tax bill.
What are your assumptions for tax returns on the commercial property? Are there any numbers built in?
There are no tax.
So this is totally devoid of any tax revenues that might occur on the commercial 10 acres.
That's right. So what we've modeled in is land sale proceeds, but we have not yet modeled in net fiscal impact. Now, there's a couple of things. One, in terms of ability to count on them, that's, the soonest those will come online would be, 5 years or so after the issuance of the debt. And so there's just that aspect of it. And then 2, we've got more analysis to do to identify what the net fiscal impacts will be. So we just did not view that as reliable a thing to model, particularly when we're trying to get down to pennies on the tax rate.
But the property tax would be payable immediately. I mean, right? You don't have to have an operation there to pay property tax. Did you model any property tax?
We did not. Yeah, that's a good point.
Don't we assume that covers the operating budget?
Well, so that's a little bit of a, we did have that internal discussion, and that is that our whole assumption in this model is that there's no pennies on the tax rate for operations. Well, is that true? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. Would the economic development help create some space on operating budgets? And how much of that's going to be left over for to pay for debt service on capital? That's another issue.
Yeah. So on the red line there, the with land sale, why does it go up at the end? I thought the goal was that it's going to go down at the end.
The modified CIP is that because we're pushing things out, that the problem with capital is if you don't do it today, you've got to do it later. So it's kind of pay me now or pay me later. And however, the reason we've put this forward is because of that that basic issue of the jump up that would need to happen if the land sale gets delayed. And that's what we're trying to grapple with and try to provide some options to de-risk that aspect of the whole transaction.
Just to make sure I understand, 4 cents is a level number. It's not 4 cents and the next year 4 more to 8, 4 more to 12. It's 4 cents level.
Yes.
And then dropping.
And so we've put it into pennies because everybody around this table understands pennies. For the public, we've put it into impact on the tax bill for the average homeowner. That's a $700,000 house, and so that's what the y-axis is.
4 cents means we need $1.6 million. Is that right? I mean, right now Penny throws off
Yes.
400,000. So if Jeff Bezos gave us $1.6 million, we would be held harmless for one of those years. Or if we were able to generate $1.6 million through some other means in excess of 2.5% normal economic growth, that's, this is like the question that Mr. Kalin was asking at our meeting the other night. Like, how are we going to afford all this?
Yeah.
Well, the answer to that is instead of growing at 2.5%, we have to be able to try to grow at a rate that will generate $1 million or $1.5 million every year in order to afford this program.
I mean, the property taxes alone, if the sale price is $40 million, you're talking about maybe $500,000 to $600,000 in property taxes, which would be over a penny on the tax rate from basically just assessed value of the land based on what you just sold it to them for.
That's right.
All right, what else you got? Ms. Hardy?
So I understand why we've kind of sequenced things the way they are based on when we get the land sale proceeds and when debt's freed off the books. But in terms of looking at the tax rate impact from a homeowner perspective, I don't think people ever believe you when you tell them that your tax rate's going to go back down. And so if we are going to raise it 4 cents for 3 years, why not do some of these projects earlier and not lower it back down to 2 cents and get some of these things done earlier? I know this chart won't look as nice, but
Yeah, so
if
you
we
do go back to, relying on the land sale proceeds, which are
No,
not
I
very
understand
sure.
the sequencing and why it looks that way, but if we have the 4 cents for 3 years, right? Like going back to the slide 16, is it possible to get, for example, the land acquisition or the turf, or, some of those other projects we pushed off done while we've got those 4 cents, say year FY 2022, instead of dropping it back down to 2 cents? Does that make sense?
So if we sell the land when we're counting on selling the land, then we could hold the tax rate flat and pull projects forward.
Yes.
That's correct. And if tax yield happens as planned, that also creates more space, more fiscal space.
I think this just looks aggressive by showing that you're going to drop it down to 2 cents, because there's going to be stuff that comes up, like whether it's on the CIP now or not, stuff's going to come up. And so I think either this version of the previous one where we thought the tax rate would go back down, I'm always hesitant about that. It'd be nice to show what our intentions are, but I think it's also worth thinking about whether there's CIP projects that we should move up if possible.
All right, what else you have? Is that the last slide? Nope.
Some affordability metrics, just to see a comparison with the other jurisdictions. I'll go over it really quickly. The first one is debt to assessed value. We have a policy of the ratio at 5%. So currently we are well below 2. With the full CIP, we'd be coming close to 5%, and the modified CIP, we're close to 4%. Yeah, we're under the policy in any
both-
scenario.
in both scenarios, we're under the
Yes.
policy. Okay.
However,
So our policy is 5%, but the state policy is 10.
10. Debt service versus expenditure, we have seen this policy and charts and triangles all through, so I don't think I need to mention here much. Debt per capita, of course, City of Falls Church is taking on a humongous amount of debt, going from 51 to 218 million should we go with all this. And there is a debt to total household income. So what this chart is telling you that right now we're somewhere between 5 and 10% our total debt to the total household income, and the total household income is median times the number of parcels that pay assessed value in taxes. So it'll grow to 30%, close to 30% if we go with the full CIP, and about 25% if we go with the modified CIP.
Those last two measures are just metrics. There's no policy tied to either
There's
of
no
those
policy
last
for
two.
this one.
And
Yes.
this one we've never done before, and it was a question that came out from Friday, and so we went with the census data and produced it. But it's not a metric that we've ever seen others use, so we might want to look at that a little bit more.
Sure.
It was kind of interesting, though.
Yeah.
Z, then
So
Masardi.
the perception that we have very wealthy households that can better bear this debt is not borne out by this slide.
Yeah, I mean, you're taking essentially with the modified CIP, if you take the total median household income, a quarter of it is your debt here, so.
But it does, I mean, it doesn't reflect each household's ability to pay, does it? It just,
No, this is just taking the median household income.
right, it's just,
Straight
it could
and-
mean that, a lot of people earn a lot of money and we bought a lot of new buildings and so we owe a lot of money. It doesn't mean that those,
Right.
Okay.
This doesn't show capacity.
thank you.
Sure.
All right, Mr. Z, you still want to make your comment?
No, I think most of it's been said already. This is kind of an astounding chart. The only comparison I can think of that would be Manassas Park. They have a high tax rate. They've managed to build out their downtown and with great civic architecture and water features and all this stuff. So we're almost at that level, but without the water feature. Might be another way of looking at it. But this is an astounding chart. Thank you.
Masardi?
So the modified CIP helped with other things, but clearly they didn't help that much with these metrics. They were still exceeding in a bunch of places and some scary places. From an external perspective, how will, for example, credit markets, rating agencies kind of view this?
It's a fair question.
I think we're done with most of the slides.
I think that's it, yeah.
Yeah.
No problem. Well, I would say, first thing I would say to you is, well, there was a visceral reaction to that last slide. That is not a metric that the rating agencies track, total debt to total household incomes for local governments, principally because you don't tax income as a local government in Virginia. You tax real estate taxes. So debt to assessed value, which you're comfortably under your city policy, whether you're peaking out at 4% or a shade over 4%, you're still comfortably within your policy. So just as a matter of fact, I mean, stepping back, how are the credit markets going to perceive this? Well, I think part of the answer is or can be found in the conversation that we just had with Moody's Investor Service. They did what they call routine surveillance, which if you haven't come to market with a public issue in a couple of years, they call you up and they want to get caught up on your finances and what's going on in the city. We had a discussion with them around the full CIP, the full 167. We told them about the land sale proceeds, how you were going to be telling the public, what the outside markers were in terms of real estate taxes, obviously with a plan to try to reduce that through land sale proceeds and smartly and strategically phasing in the debt and the like. And they got comfortable with it. So much so that they affirmed your AA1 rating. You have AAA ratings from the other two credit rating agencies. Moody's has traditionally been the highest, and in fact, my colleague Jennifer, sitting over there, was on the committee that rated the city's bonds, and so she's seen this from both sides of the aisle. So while the full CIP is certainly feasible from a ratings perspective, meaning I wouldn't expect an impending downgrade if it's done thoughtfully and communicated and conveyed thoughtfully, I will say that the higher the leverage, the higher the debt, the more overall risk that they perceive. Your debt ratios get high. What we've maybe talked around a little bit, they start to ask questions about implementation risk. If you're doing the full CIP across a number of different major projects, that's a lot for a small city to take on in terms of just managing project risk and so forth. The modified CIP does take some of that risk off the table. It also takes some of the risk off the table in terms of the timing of the land sale proceeds. On the one hand, they're not making any more real estate inside the Beltway. That land is worth something, and it's going to go for a good value at some point, but you can't perfectly time when those dollars are going to get realized and the amount of them. So proceeding at a little bit more measured pace on the full CIP makes the overall project a little more manageable, but if you felt like you wanted to take advantage of still very low interest rates and try to get into the full CIP. That's something that could be done. I won't guarantee you that you won't get one agency that's going to get nervous about it and lower your rating. I can't guarantee that. But what I can tell you is that the one that's had the most vigor in terms of their process and is generally the hardest rating agency to move in terms of getting them comfortable with things, which is Moody's, they just reaffirmed your rating and, in fact, kept the rating on a positive outlook, which means that they feel like the process we're all going through here tonight has a lot of value in their minds. So, does that answer your question?
How long is that rating good for?
Well, as a technical matter, a rating outlook lasts for 1 to 2 years before they have to resolve it one way or the other. They'll either pull it back to stable at AA1 or they'll upgrade you to AAA. And I think in talking with them, they know this referendum's coming up. They want to see this thought process play out a little more. At the time we were talking, you didn't have the feasibility study results, you didn't have the site development recommendations and so forth. I think post-referendum, if the referendum should be successful and everybody decides that they want to proceed forward in some form or fashion, I think they'll probably resolve it at the next time you do a public rating, whether it's for the school or for some other purpose, based on, how this all stitches together after you've made some decisions.
Okay, any other comments?
What if
questions?
it doesn't succeed?
If the referendum should fail, probably takes risk off from their point of view, and every other metric, as Mr. Shields did a very good job of articulating during our calls. Since they put the positive outlook on initially, every other metric that they track vis-a-vis the city has improved, financially, economically, and otherwise. The one holdup for them in taking you to AAA, this is Moody's only I'm speaking of, is the amount of debt you're taking on and what your strategic plan is to manage that. And again, they took a lot of comfort in the very types of conversations that we're having in a very public way here tonight.
Mr. Z?
Well, I thank you for that measured delivery of where you think our risk is with respect to our creditworthiness. I do have a final thought that's not completely related to that, but as I begin walking the neighborhoods and I don't know that the typical household exists. You talk about the $600,000 house, and there are a bunch of them, but they're primarily occupied by either a young couple or empty nester, and so it would be of interest to me to see whether there's a increased sense of urgency to cash in, get out while the going's good before the tax rate goes up. There are people that live in $1.5 million houses with 3 kids in their school system that tell me that they can't afford another $350 on their taxes every month. So these will be all of the things that will interest me as I knock on doors and ask what they think of this scenario. But I do applaud the city manager for making the very difficult presentation to move certain things out. There are constituencies for all these projects. Thank you.
Okay, any, Vice Mayor Connolly?
Have we ever had a AAA rating from Moody's? Or we've been striving for that for a while?
That's correct, but we never have.
We never have. So this is the best we've ever had? Okay.
And S&P rated us AAA for the first time 4 years ago?
Sounds right.
Fitch rated us AAA for a decade.
Okay, any other comments, questions? A lot to think about, although we're not going to resolve it tonight, but I think a lot on the table here.
What are we doing? This is the Karen Oliver question. What are we doing?
Well, I mean, I don't know, I mean, I guess we have to be.
We got to vote on this next month, right?
Mr. Shields, in some ways, I mean, is this, obviously clarity as soon as possible is required, but does this alter, for example, the trajectory of the school, whether we make a decision next week or not?
Well, in the schedule that's been laid out, the referendum question and the amendment of the CIP are done at the same time. It is meet, right, and proper that you have the school in the CIP before you put it in, before you approve it as a referendum question. So that should be done. These other decisions, they are important for our planning. I mean, the library, the library board would like to get started next week in terms of architecture and engineering. And so if there's going to be reconsideration of that, it would be helpful to everybody to know that. And likewise with the other projects. So one option could be the ordinance that's presented to you has it's all in. It can be reduced between first reading and second reading, and this discussion could be carried out to town hall meetings, and you get more opportunities for public input. That could happen at your next meeting on June 26th, where we essentially do the same presentation. The public will be much more aware of what's being discussed, and you can get feedback on that, and then make your ultimate decisions between first reading and second reading. That would be an option for you. If you start taking projects out right now and have them in the ordinance that's before you, I don't know whether the city attorney has an opinion as to whether you can add them back in between first reading and second reading. I think her preference generally would be it's better to take things out between first reading and second reading rather than put things in. So I think that's my advice to you, I guess, at this point is if you know what you want to do right now, we can take that direction and present the ordinance as you desire. If you wish to have more public input on that, then there'd be opportunities. You'll get it on June 26th, and we can set up further opportunities between then and July 24th.
Okay, thoughts from people? Is anyone prepared to?
So let me tell you what I'm for, and you tell me what you're going to bring that I would vote for. So I want to keep the CIP as it was April 24th and add $120 million new high school and improved middle school. So have you got something that I can support if that's my position? Improved middle school, new high school improved, just the language
The
that's
full
in the bond
CIP
referendum.
plus the school.
The April 24th CIP.
And what about TJ?
So TJ is not in the ordinance that's before the council because we have not received a request from the school board for TJ to be put into the CIP.
Right. And so, again, I'm going back to the April 24th CIP that we discussed, years of work's gone into it. It was what it was then, and it would remain in force, and then add $120 million for a new high school and improved middle school. Is what you've given us here that, or?
Yeah, the ordinance that's in your packet right now
That's
is
what that says. Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
All right, other input? Thanks. People have any idea what they'd like to do? Vice Mayor Connolly, then Ms. Oliver.
If we adopt what Phil would like, does that require us to redo our fiscal policies right now or later?
They should be amended, yes. And so I would not recommend that. I think that would be very difficult to do between now and July 24th. I think we could probably separate that out as another issue, but that needs to then be put right at the top of the agenda to get that done.
Ms. Oliver?
If I could just add, the slide that we didn't really get to in the presentation tonight is the risk slide.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And I wonder whether for public presentation, it might be possible to pull that forward as a part of the introduction to what we're going to talk about, because I don't want to get to the end of the public presentation and skip over the risk slide again. And I think that one of the things that we need to somewhere note in the public presentation is that we would be approving a CIP that was not in compliance with our fiscal policies with the intention to change our fiscal policies.
Other thoughts? Mr. Z?
I think from a reasonable man point of view that if you hope to sell the referendum this fall, if we hope to sell the referendum this fall, that we have to exert leadership and take some hard steps and do it early and just be done with it. You don't want this dragging out until fall. So, that's my opinion.
So what does that mean, though? Does that mean you want to do the abbreviated CIP, or?
That means that we should strongly consider adopting the modified CIP. Move out the library, get rid of a bunch of stuff in our current other CIP basket, get TJ out to at least 25, maybe 26. You can bring it back up again if you want to, but at least we're saying it's out there. I think that's the only way we'll be able to get the school project done. We have to focus on what's important. Thank you.
Ms. Oliver?
So, as I understand it, we can bring the full CIP in the first reading and then modify it between now and the second reading. So my preference would be to bring the full CIP. And in addition, if the full CIP does not include TJ, I think that for the first reading, we should stick a placeholder in there, because you're talking throughout this presentation about pushing out the TJ project that's not even in the CIP. So I'm sorry, but we know, and I think also if we're going to have a full community discussion about the whole of our needs, the question is going to come up, what about TJ? What about MEH? And to the extent that Dr. Noonan has said that we really should be doing TJ sooner than 2025, right? We're pushing it. It ought to start out in what we present next Monday.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, on that last request, just in terms as a matter of protocol, I typically would not put something in the CIP that hasn't been formally requested by the school board. So I don't think we're going to be able to provide that by by June 26th.
Can you put a placeholder in for other school projects not yet determined?
Well, so the Planning Commission is key. They have a really important role in this, and so after June 26th, it gets referred to them. And so what does need to be referred to them is, I would ask that the council say one way or the other, are you okay with taking the modified and the full to the Planning Commission so you can get their input on that? And so they would need to, what they will do is take action on July 17th, I believe.
And just to confirm the timeline, we are amending the FY18 to 22 CIP, which is why TJ is not in there if it's 23, 24, 25, minus the fact that we don't have a school board. So part of it, moving it forward, if you want a placeholder, would be a different timeline, or it adds into the 5-year window that we're amending.
No, it is a placeholder just in terms of we put it into the model so you can see it. But that's different from
I don't think we should
actually voting on it as part of the adopted plan.
I don't think we should limit the fact that we have a 5-year CIP. If we know that the costs are out there and we know that it's modeled in this version, that we should include it in there. So I'm with Ms. Oliver, and I'd like to see it in there, whether it's placeholder or official or not, because I think we're just fooling ourselves if we pretend that the TJ costs aren't coming.
Okay. Vice Mayor Conley.
Ms. Hardy, I thought had an interesting question related to slide 16, where we have the modified CIP tax impact with the land sale, where we dropped down to 2 cents. Suppose we just did want to keep it at 4 cents all across. Would that allow us to pull the library closer? Would that allow us to say we could do the library in 2022 instead of 2025?
Ms. Bowell?
Potentially. However, we'll need to feed in the model, and I can confer back with you at the next council meeting what the exact timeline would be. I'm sure we can put it earlier, but how many years? We'll have an exact answer for you at the next meeting.
Thank you. I think that's important. The ones that were pushing out, the library is the one that already went through a referendum, has a considerable amount of community support behind it. If there's a way to not push it all the way to 2025, but do it in 2022, that's more palatable. Oh, sorry, more palatable.
If I recall, the cost of the library was, it's under 2 cents on the tax rate, and but at any rate, these pennies they're an output from trying to use the reserves in a way that smooths the pennies out, and so it's there's a little bit of the guts of the model that produces that.
I would also associate myself with Mr. Duncan on his concern of keeping $3 million in the capital reserves. I think the intent of that policy was to build up our capital reserves, not take from our large windfall. I think the large windfall really is meant to go towards the school projects, and then we should be building up capital reserves separately, as we're doing right now with the 1.5 cents. But it just doesn't seem to make sense that we're going to count on the water sale proceeds for pay-go capital when the water sale proceeds really have been designated towards school capital.
One quick thought, if I may. There's been a lot of back and forth about the capital reserve, and I appreciate that. One thing that's worth noting, a couple of you have asked for clarification as to whether or not the general fund unassigned fund balance, whether that would be at the lower end of your target range or the upper end, and the answer has come back at the upper end. Not knowing when I'll be in front of you next as you make these decisions and have your deliberations, I wanted to let you know that given the amount of debt you're taking on, whether it's the full or the modified CIP, maintaining an unassigned fund balance at the upper end of that target range is going to be critically important in offsetting the rating agency's concerns about the overall level of debt. So there may be a temptation as you go through to say, well, let's balance it out by taking a little bit from unassigned fund balance. That's not going to square well in the credit markets. So
You just said that because you knew that you and I might not get a chance to talk again. It's good to talk with you again. I just wanted to run through, since Mr. Z, referred to what you hear people say at the door. To me, this dialogue's a good dialogue. It's important for you to come here and say that, and the other things you said. The 7 things that I wrote down that I hear people say, I think we've covered only one of them, which, well, 2 maybe if you count us on fund balance, which, leads me to have to say that this is a very conservatively constructed program. So the money that we're counting on, the upfront ground lease money, okay, $43.5 million, we factor that in. We're not factoring in, as you said, any annual tax revenues from economic development on the 10 acres. Those just current taxes, property tax, BPOL, just the basic stuff. We're not factoring in any annual tax revenues from the creation of a special tax district mechanism on either the 10 acres or on the FRIT land or the buyer land, which we all, believe and hope will be part of a, small area plan, economic renaissance. Understand if you create that tax district, it may reduce to some degree the purchase price of the ground lease price of the land, but still, special tax district mechanism is something that you hear talked about in the community. Very important to restrain annual operating costs on the school and city side. I would, suggest 2.5% annually for 3 years on both sides as we, tackle this difficult challenge. Again, in the operating category, the consolidation of services of the schools and general government, particularly in the HR and financial services areas, perhaps other opportunities to show that we are, trying to right-size our government going ahead and restrain operating costs by achieving efficiencies that are, not going to impact service, but will save salary costs. Elevating the performance of the property appraisal office. We do well now, but we are not a region leader. The gap between, purchase price on a commercial property and the assessed value of that property is sometimes, noticeable and considerable. And as far as I can tell, that's just money that we're leaving on the table that we need to be able to pick up again in the environment that we're heading into. And then finally, the unassigned fund balance. So, my view of the undesignated fund balance is it's there for 2 reasons. One is to make the rating agencies happy. Two is to absorb, catastrophic shocks when we've had catastrophic shocks and absorb them. And the amount of money that's in there now and the size of the challenge that we face is, I think, unprecedented in the city's history. And as we tell the story to the ratings agencies, it would be helpful if in smoothing out the tax impact of this very, necessary and ambitious program on the taxpayer here today, we would be able to basically create the Bank of Falls Church. Borrow a certain amount of money from ourselves with the promise to pay it back. That's the way our unassigned fund balance policy is written. It can be between 12 and 17%. If it gets down, there's a certain amount of time to pay it back. That is a mechanism that we could use, in my opinion, to smooth out the impact, because, my, big concern is that the program is going to be a lot to swallow and that the referendum will not pass. And we're making some progress, but, the 5 or 6 things there that I listed that's money that we could use to further smooth the tax rate impact in the first 5 years until we, see revenues from the development that we all believe and hope will occur.
Okay. All right. Let's wrap up pretty soon. We do have the City Hall presentation to follow.
Yeah, I would just like to respond to what Mr. Duncan said and say that I do not think that this is a financially conservative model. I think that this is a very risky decision. I think the fact we didn't get to the risk slide might have hidden part of that fact. I think if you look at the gap on slides 10 and 16 between what the impact is going to be if we sell the land or not, it makes you realize how extraordinarily dependent we are on that sale. And I think that to say that this is not risky, I think that misleads people. This is risky. It has potential. We have the possibility to mitigate the impact on people and to make this affordable, but it is dependent on a very critical element. And to assume that we're going to get it in, what did you say, 2021, the first tranche of money? Not only are we assuming the sale, but we're assuming a sale on certain terms that provide money at an interval that helps us make this affordable. I don't want to say that we can't do this, but don't characterize this as not, as a very conservative scenario. This is an ambitious, this is a creative financing scenario. This is a way of approaching the problem to try to make it possible to swallow, but it is highly dependent on a critical assumption that we cannot control.
Okay, anything else?
Can I add a couple of comments to this? Just building on to what Ms. Oliver just said, we are in the 9th year of our economic recovery since the last economic downturn. And based on that, it's good to assume that should the land sales go through, yes, we have a revenue stream that would possibly come through various measures, business as well as residential. However, if we need to see how robust are the assumptions of and the timing of the land sale proceeds. If we were to delay it by a few years, or should the property be valued at the same price, in 2-4 years from now, when we are expecting in 22, when we're expecting those reserves. And the other thing I want to mention is on the policy, the industry best practice, according to the Government Finance Officers Association, the debt to expenditure policy best practice is 8 to 12%. We're already on the high end of that spectrum. So any revisions or modifications we want to make, we really need to be very thoughtful of where we want to go from there. Just laying it out.
Okay, great. Why don't we go ahead and wrap this conversation up and move on to the next. Mr. Webb.
Just want to say real quick that with all the decisions and the slides we've seen tonight, it definitely is a very big decision that we're all talking about on both sides of the desk here. But I just want to say that from my side of the shop here, of looking at it from the perspective of the true need for a new high school, I think we've long since, we've kicked that can down the road a number of times where it could have been possibly cheaper, but decades ago, councils and school boards weren't necessarily bold enough to make that leap a decade ago, if not more, because this school has long since lived its life. But we are a city that prides ourselves on our schools, and if any of you have been in George Mason in the last few years, you know that it's getting closer and closer, if not already there, to an embarrassment to go into of the condition of the school. We are at the point that the folks who are willing to pay the now fairly high tax rate that they're paying now, they're paying that because they get the small class sizes, the quality education that we have been known for in the region, that if we continue to keep on kicking the can down the road, folks are not going to move into Falls Church, and then we're still going to have some of the same issues and concerns that we're talking about now. So I with all due respect, I do get it. I live here as other folks do, and paying taxes at different points and levels. But I think more and more people are recognizing that we have to do this at some point. And if we continue to push it down the road, all it's going to do is get more and more expensive to do, and we're going to invest more and more money into piecing it together to keep it running.
Okay. Thank you very much. Why don't we go ahead and wrap this conversation up and move on to the next phase?
Can I note that it is after 10 o'clock and make a motion that we continue the meeting?
Sure. We have a
But
second.
Could we take a 3 second?
Sure. We'll
2-minute break?
take a 2-minute break. All right. Let's do it. Mr. Shields, we've got the City Hall Public Safety Project update. I know I've heard a fair amount about this, and I guess these are just going to be the changes that we have been made since the last responses to questions since the last time we heard this a week or two ago.
That is correct. So when we were before the council last, we were asked questions about to provide a good crosswalk about the differences between where we are today and where we have been. We were also asked to provide an option for City Hall that really just is focused exclusively on the courthouse and the Sallyport issues, and that option is Cindy will present that to you. And then we have the attachments, which are updates on other public input that we've gotten. Letter from Judge McHugh, and letter from the City of Alexandria Sheriff's Office, which came in to do an assessment as well. So we'll provide an update on those items. I'll turn it over to Cindy, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Shields and council. Yes, this is a follow-up to the May 22nd council meeting when we gave you an update on the paradigm shift in order to meet program goals and meet budget limits. Since that time, council asked for some additional community engagement, and as Mr. Shields noted, the crosswalk and the options. I'm joined this evening by Chief Gavin, so if there's any specific security questions or perspectives from public safety, we have that. And James Mack, our project manager, has been able to join us from the Planning Commission, and I believe Chief Deputy Sheriff Matt Kay is in the building. So some of the things that you have before you is a summary memo.
Actually, it's, I have the Planning Commission work session that
Oh,
they're
okay.
going to start. Yeah.
So you're going back
it's
up.
bad timing that I jumped in right now.
So what we have before you is a summary memo. I do want to call your attention to the memo from the the City Hall Public Safety Task Force. You asked if the task force had met. We had wanted to brief council on the change prior to convening the task force, so you all heard it first. So the task force did meet on June 5th. The memo is dated June 15, and you will see on page 2 that they have recommended, one, that additional costs be added to the project to permit the future expansion of the structure in the back to support office and parking. So I'll show you that option. They also, and that we provide that to council. They also directed staff to proceed with the project as currently funded because it does meet the goals. as they've been working through all along. And they did ask that we also draft options to reconfigure the existing surface spaces to increase parking, which is something that staff and Public Works we can work on, even though it's slightly outside of this project scope and budget. So that's the task force recommendations. You do have the Architectural Advisory Board comments. We did an advisory briefing, second update to them, because we'd done that last fall. So you have those comments. And then I want to note that we have provided two pieces of correspondence from the courts and judicial system. One is from the City of Alexandria Sheriff's Office, and what Chief Gavin did was reach out to a independent third party who recently has redone their courthouse. But since the Sheriff's Association full assessment was 2006 and the U.S. Marshals was 2005, this would give an update to general best practices for safety, and also we had the opportunity for them to do a full site visit and look at our current plans. So you have their assessment that they find that that would meet the significant security and safety issues that we have currently existing. And then Judge McHugh, who has been the judge we've been working with on the safety security of the courthouse committee, has submitted a letter today. He had expressed willingness to come to tonight's meeting, but we know you had a full agenda and it would be late on your agenda before we came up. So in lieu of him coming this evening, I offered that maybe he could just put his thoughts in writing. It is at a high level because he doesn't want to go into detail in security in an open forum, but is glad to come for future closed session if you so needed that or wished it. So with that said, I'd like to spend most of the time on the crosswalk so that we can look at the follow-up from the May 22nd council meeting. That is the large ledger sheet that's color-coded, because we tried to get it into one page and also be readable. And I have put it up on the screen, and it is on the city's website as well. The top third of the page is the crosswalk that Mr. Z was asking about when we met on the 22nd. So what we have done is taken the existing facility as it is today, compared the program design to the 2014 feasibility study, where we did a lot of detail on what the program needs were for a 20-year window, looked at the 2016 schematic design that Studio 27 recommended that would really maximize space and build out. This is the one that then, when we cost estimated it, came in over. And so the fourth column is the design that we presented to you on May 22nd for meeting the $13 million budget. So the question was, how can you do $13 million and still get the program goals met? So what we tried to do is give you staff space comparisons, meeting room comparisons, for example, the two top sort of greenish bay colors. So you can see currently we have 137. Dewberry had recommended 142. The current design's at 145. So as you go through this, you can see that we're still within the Dewberry range where we had done the programmatic analysis. Some of the things are actually better because of shifting where chamber resides. One of the things in the staff spaces we've done in order to accommodate a 20-year build-out is we've reduced the number of lockable office with walls and doors, to more work session spaces, because it allows us the flexibility to redesign as services, programs, and technology changes. Secure meeting rooms, spaces designated for the court, the central lobby, and the building entrances are then laid out in blue below the public meeting rooms. And what you can see with the public meeting rooms, we've increased from currently 4 to 7. That's basically where we were in the Dewberry. But where we save space is in the courts, because in the Studio 27 design, a lot of that was just for courts. It wasn't shared uses, so it wasn't utilized 75 to 80% of the time. So we've done a lot of sharing of spaces. So You can see Dewberry's 12 for rooms for court, reduced back down to 6 where we are now. The central entrance lobby is a big square footage and construction cost savings because we're not doing a big 2-story open atrium with another cross connection between wings. So you just save a lot of construction costs by having 2 connections between east and west wing versus 3. The building entrances is another significant improvement now, and you can see the comparisons there. I do want to call out the service counter areas. Right now we have 12 service counters. In the current proposal, it's 8. But what is significantly different is all 8 of those are direct access from the main entrance because they're off the cross axle, and then you have the verticals. Whereas right now you would have, of those 12 service counters, only 1 is direct access from the entrance. Elevators, we actually end up with 3, maintaining 2 for public, which we had mentioned. A lot of the public comment was to have 2 public, so in case one went down, we had redundancy. The next section really looks at the law enforcement areas, and yes,
The
ma'am.
way the building is set up, is there a way to get from the east wing to the west wing?
Yes, so
Other than the main,
you'll have the main floor, and this G corridor that's behind me will still exist, so you'll have 2 connections to east and west.
and will there be a connection, will there be a second floor on the current courtroom?
No.
There won't, so that'll still, okay.
So it'll still be big and open, but there won't be a direct connection, but you'll be right at, aligned with the elevators and stairwells, which earlier you would have been out in front of the building having to get into the elevators. So what we did under the law enforcement section is give you the ability to see what we don't have now, what we had planned in 2014, and what will exist in the $13 million design. The change there, of course, is the campus secured parking will be 33 instead of 44, and your campus non-secured parking actually will be where we had proposed in 2014, but not as high as it was last December when you saw it. The difference can be, and that's why the task force asked us to look at enhancing surface parking, is picking up 20 or so spaces minimally with just some basic curb and painting to make up that difference. A full redesign of that parking garage or parking lot would increase. Surface parking, as we all know, is less costly than structure.
So does that 176 include that reconfigured?
No, so that would be on top. This is only speaking to the specific City Hall project, so it's basically right around the footprint and the structured and parking as it exists, but not resurfacing, restriping. We did want to call out the generator.
Sorry, one more thing. How much does it cost to restripe? Factor in?
It's nominal, but it would not be within this budget, so we'd work with the Public Works operating budget to stripe and change some few curbs. 2,000 to 4,000 per spot would be a reasonable range, and for some of that it'd be high if we're just painting, but if we have to do curbs and any of that. Generator, actually was a live experience today as we lost power with the generator. We're only partially have generation in this building for the core public safety. In this plan, we would have the entire building on generator. And then you can see the code compliance, efficiency of the envelope, and accessibility. In all 3 plans, we would still achieve those. Down below is where we start to get into the cost options that we were asked to provide. So as a sort of a landmark, if you see the column, last column on the right that has the salmon at the top and then it has sort of the salmon bars along it, that traces down to the options down below. So where it says current design, that kind of allows you to see sort of the comparisons without having to flip between the crosswalk to the options. So the 2017 design in the bottom is the 13.2, the $13 million option, broken out by the components. So you see the rear north, the chambers, and ADA and public space, and you can see the square footage and the dollar amount associated with them. And I'll talk in a moment about the mandatory systems replacement that's highlighted and site work. So for the 13 million, the current proposed and recommended design by city staff is in the middle column. And then down below, you can see that same crosswalk that was above associated with that dollar amount. The columns to the left and right then are two options. To the right is the task force proposal, which is at 16.7. And basically the difference for that then is adding a future story in the rear and making sure that that structure is concrete and can support future growth and office space and not just be the steel structure. So the costs go up proportionally to that. That's the task force recommendation that I referenced earlier. To the left of the current design, labeled mandatory safety concept, that is in response to Mr. Snyder's questions of what do you need to do just to address the public safety. And in order to do that, it really is the majority of the program and the project. So you'll see it's 8.8 million because you have to have the structured parking in the back, you have the new chambers, you have the ADA, it's basically 79 square feet, it's the ramp in the front. And you only do public safety space and improvements, the meeting rooms, the wayfinding, the service counters, nominally what you need to connect the new construction. You are not redoing the east and west wings. That's the only savings to this. And you don't do new HVAC and plumbing in those wings either. You don't redo to LED lighting. So you really are cutting down to the public safety piece. But you do have to plan for redesign and escalation costs because that's going to delay your project, and that's how you get to the 8.8. Now to the mandatory systems replacement that I noted before, you'll see in the mandatory safety components there's 3.6 million required, and that is for end-of-life systems. It is already included in the current design for 17 and the task force proposal. So of the 8.8 million, almost 4 million, almost 50% of it is things you're going to have to do. So in the box at the very bottom of this chart, you'll see that mandatory systems replacement spelled out in a little more detail. Those are the end-of-life things that are end-of-life now and within 3 years are going to have to be addressed. They're failing now. Just behind council in this closet, the HVAC system condenser failed, and we had water all over the IT equipment, for example. So under this category is the HVAC replacement. Basically, you're not going to take out the current system or any of the ductwork. You're just going to replace the boilers, chillers, and cooling towers, compressors, like kind, in like location. The west wing windows and also behind chambers, those have asbestos in the window heating cooling units. They've been encapsulated 3 times. We now, if we don't proceed with the full project redoing the HVAC, we need to fully remove that asbestos. And so that cost is in here. The elevators regularly fail and have to be replaced. Window replacement is nominally just to take care of locks, storm windows falling off, windows falling in, the exterior doors. And the generator is end of life, and it actually didn't fully come online today, so even our partially generated building wasn't generated. So all that adds up to the 3.6. That's then the line item up above. So Mayor and Council, that is in a quick snapshot of great works that James did to put a whole lot of information on one page to try to let you see what you get in the different options and what's changed between 2014 and the
Thank you very
recommended
much.
proposal.
Yeah, thank you for getting through that so quickly. We appreciate it, given the late hour. Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. This is great. So I appreciate this level of detail and being responsive to our feedback. I'm getting deja vu from being actually in the school work stream when we looked at like 13 options and what was the bare minimum we could do, and still being really surprised by how little you get done for the amount of money. So I had that same reaction here with kind of that mandatory safety concept. Sounds like almost $9 million doesn't buy you very much. That said, I was curious about the main difference between the task force proposal and what the new 13 million version is. Is that just bolstering the new garage in the back and not even making the second floor available for parking, or does it make it available for parking?
No, it's just bolstering it.
Cost us $3 million more, $3.5 million.
And I think a lot of that is you've got escalation costs, you've got redesign costs. There's already a lot of sunk costs that we've already put into the current design that would have to be pulled out and redone.
It's like the same design can't work, but you just make it ready for a second floor later on, or?
It's a lot of structural engineering design, so it's not just taking it and just making a bigger radius or something.
Yeah, because I did have that concern when we first talked about this. It just seemed short-sighted to not add that second level, knowing that we might want that extra parking space, especially since we decreased it on the actual campus itself. And so at the same time, though, it just seems like an awful amount of money just to make the pillars stronger.
Yeah, so if you look in the task force, you can see the square footage for the law enforcement addition in the rear is the same, but the dollar amount goes up from shifting from steel to concrete. And then you're going to have some redesign costs. And then depending on how long that delays the project, we have a rough estimate of an escalation in there, and that's a fair amount where your cost is. So if we didn't lose too much time in the redesign, that might come down, but you're still going to have your construction costs, redesign, and some delay costs.
Okay.
Vice Mayor Conley.
So the construction totals for these two options, we've got the almost $9 million option, the $13 million plus, and almost $18 million. We don't have that $18 million in any CIP anywhere, right?
That would be
The
correct.
task-
What you have appropriated is the $13 million for the City Hall project. The task force felt it was important, and I'll defer to Mr. Duncan if he wants to add any comments because he was in attendance. But they felt it was important to call that out because they felt it was short-sighted to build that structure that can't support anything in the future. Now, if we build it now and wait 30 years, would the next contractor and engineer feel confident with that structure? They still may recommend that they'd have to start over. But if we build it that way now, in the next 2 to 5 to 10 years on a modified out-year CIP when debt comes down, then maybe you could add on.
Okay, other comments, thoughts?
Well, I want to thank the city staff, and in particular the project manager, Mr. Mock, for working on satisfying our requirements for a crosswalk that makes sense, that we can understand. It's a very clever use of space on this page, and it's given me a good appreciation for what the current design encompasses, and would appear to be the best compromise of achieving the objectives and still staying within the current budget. I also think I hear that small amount of work required to reinforce the structure to take on a second story. I might argue that it should or perhaps could be less, but given our presentation earlier tonight on the CIP, I just don't ever expect a second floor to be added within my ability to ever care about it, or to say it will be well past the life of this addition as well. So, so having said that, I think that the current design that takes into account all the failing systems and satisfies the safety requirements is probably the optimum solution. And I would say that we don't spend the time redesigning it one more time to put in more concrete and steel.
Okay, other comments? Mr. Duncan?
Just the other thing that we talked about in the task force meeting was parking. And the, very little change in the number of parking places available with the $13 million option. And the question arose, could we do something with the surface parking that's there now? Or could we increase surface parking by, creating a true parking lot instead of a lot which is interrupted by a variety of islands and plants and trees and so forth? Were we able to get any cost estimate on what we could accomplish in terms of surface parking?
We haven't been able to work through the cost estimates yet for option one, which is restriping and a little bit of curb and gutter, which probably, based on initial walk-arounds, probably 20 spots, but we don't have a cost. And then the more detailed redo and grid will take a little longer to get the costs in between getting this done and the task force meeting. We didn't have time to do that analysis.
Okay.
It's still something we could plan for. It's outside of this budget scope.
Right. I get that. I mean, again, the CIP as we passed it in April included the $13.3 million budget. So if we were able to do anything on surface parking, we would have to make it a later year add-on, which wouldn't affect the building itself, but could change the geometrics of the campus if it just turned out that the parking was wholly inadequate for a city that is growing and might continue to grow.
Anything we're constructing up here wouldn't impact basically the lower lots if we wanted to redo them, either with some low-cost operational money as an interim and then a future planning for a larger parking lot.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. Oliver.
Can I just ask, does the city have an active TDM program? Are we doing anything to incentivize people to bicycle to work?
Pay them all about 30% more.
Yeah. I would like to, hey, come July 1, we got a new thing coming out of HR. Awesome. And it didn't cost anything on the budget side. But we are doing bike share, and we do plan to have a station here. This plan will have bike share. We currently have in the design a unisex shower to count towards lead and to allow for people to bike to work and shower and still be fresh while serving citizens. So we do have that. Come July 1, as part of our wage work, that's a really important thing. Wage work medical flex plan, we are going to be able to offer employees the opportunity to do pre-tax dollars and take out their transit costs just like you would take your med flex or your daycare expenses out. So we will be able to serve to some extent that. We have a unfunded commuter incentive policy that we hope at some point to be able to reactivate, but this pre-tax dollar actually is a decent savings for those that are using transit. It doesn't help if you walk or bike, but it will help with transit.
I just know that on a lot of the economic development that we've looked at, we have asked for active TDMs as in an effort to support reduced parking being available. And I think we need to do this ourselves, and I would charge you, I know it's an operational issue, but I'm hearing this issue around parking, and anything we can do to incentivize other employees and even other people to not drive to the community center and the city hall unless they have to would be helpful.
And I think the bike share will help because it'll allow people to bike here, and also employees that need to go to the Flower Building to meet with the school staff or to the property yard could bike instead of driving. So hopefully we'll help to change that culture. And I think the Planning Commission actually just had a TDM presentation today, and we did do a TDM analysis on City Hall, so we have a list of recommendations from Foursquare that we can implement as well over time.
All right, why don't we wrap up this conversation? It's getting late. Any other comments? Vice Mayor Conley.
So what action do you want from us tonight?
There is no action required of council this evening. We just felt it was important to follow up with your May 22nd and make sure you had it in the context of your CIP discussion. Council has already appropriated the money, approved the Studio 27 contract in CMAR. So the next formal action will be when we come back to council in September with the qualified maximum price construction contract for you to review and approve or not.
But at our last council meeting, there was concerns that many members raised about going forward while the CIP is still in flux. And so are you planning to go forward now? Or are you waiting until we have the CIP discussion?
We are actually going forward because that way we can give you the best information from any public engagement, also through the Planning Commission. So the Planning Commission had their first work session on this project redesign so that they can give you reaction and comments as well.
How much are you
So it all
spending
comes
right
together.
now?
In terms of what we're spending right now, we've really been trying to keep the architect and the builders at bay. So almost everything you've seen here is staff driven, and we've not been going back to them with redesigns and things like that to try to minimize those costs. But in terms of what we're spending right now,
Yeah, we're through the development design phase, and
Yeah.
I did bring up that spreadsheet. Can you?
Yeah, so just maybe off the top of my head, we probably have over 900,000 left in their contract, but we've gone through design development, like Cindy said, so that's going to be a pretty large, substantial chunk of that money that's gone out. And the contract with HIT right now is about 50,000, so it's not that substantial. But we have been moving ahead with the design because there's a lot of stuff that happens on the back end, mechanical engineering, structural engineering, geotechnical. So there's a lot of stuff that we have been spending money on. And so I think
Money you spend and what's your run rate? I mean, I think that was the direction of council at the last meeting, is that we want to get our arms around Southern Ethics and they get our arms around the CIP, which is the process that we're in.
Yep. So the way we're timing is this so that it would be concurrent with your analysis so that you'd have all the public engagement and the Planning Commission's assessment on the site plan when you make your final decision on the CIP for affordability.
but
That is
we have
scheduled
the
for-
numbers on the run rate. I've seen them, and I think we just don't have them right in front of us. So we will email those out to you, and we can, if you have any further comment on those, we will hear them formally on June 26th, but also if you have any other feedback on them.
Well, isn't it also true that you're looking to begin construction this October? So if you're not done in time so that everything is complete, you're not going to make that construction season, which means that you'll be another $1.5 million, $2 million in escalation for next year, right? So, I mean, that's really what's driving this.
But the question has been asked, and so we'll make sure you understand what it is we're spending right now. But that is absolutely true. In terms of the cost savings, one of the big things that happened when we went back to HIT to ask for them to reduce their costs was they said, well, you're planning to start next spring. If you start now, or not now, if you start this fall before the winter, that saves you X $100,000. And so that was part of the whole package.
Yep.
Our initial plan was to start in like mid-January or something, and that HIT said if you advance this up to October, you get a cost saving. So that was really the driving force behind this.
Which helped us keep to the program that you saw in the crosswalk and the budget.
Okay, anything else? Thank you very much for that presentation and for all your fine work on this project. Why don't we go on to
Thank you,
council
council.
schedule and requests and then try to wrap up. Are there any requests from council or scheduling issues? Mr. Z and then Ms. Hardy.
I won't be here next Monday. I'll be in Denver. Sorry, I had already previous announced this. I will be at a seminar with paid for largely by Cog to learn all about resilience and how other cities around this country are dealing with that issue. Bring that back
Sounds
to us.
good. Let us know how it goes. Ms. Hardy?
Thank you, Mayor. So I think last time we talked about whether there is value or the need to have another town hall in the month of July. So between the school project or school work stream wrapping up, the economic development stuff, the CIP discussion, our big decision before July 24th, if we can find a date for that, do we have a potential date in mind, or is that underway?
We have not yet identified a date, but we will do so, and so we will plan to have a town hall meeting in July. Not the week of the Independence Day, but probably the week after.
Can I ask also on the schedule that you note the July and August committee meetings, if they are meeting?
Back to the town hall, if I could make a suggestion for us to consider something other than Saturday mornings. I mean, it's summers, so we're going to have probably lower attendance, but Saturday mornings, I've just gotten consistent feedback, just never work well for many people.
Okay.
Sunday afternoons seem okay. Even a weeknight or multiple options. I just want to make sure we're flexible and can accommodate people.
All right.
Vice Mayor Conley.
Two things. I think we need to have a closed meeting Monday night after just. Sorry, we need to have a closed meeting Monday evening to discuss city attorney's, clerk, and manager reviews. I sent an email out to all of you asking for feedback. So we need to. Can we schedule that meeting? And then my other thing is, this is also related to summer. Maybe I said this last week, but Miss Hardy and I went to the PTA meeting last Monday with the boards from Perkins Eastman. There were community members there who had not attended the community meeting, and I thought I was going to drop off the boards and leave. And there were so many people that were so interested in what we were discussing because we brought the boards to them. And I really think we need to plan this summer at the concerts in the park, at other events that the city is having where there are people that city council members and school board members and staff, we set up a schedule so that we're there at those meetings explaining all these things because it's really complex. And once people get it, they get it. But it's one person at a time. They're not going to understand everything we just talked about by reading an article or FAQs. It really requires lots of high touch. And I feel like we all need to be engaged in that high touch.
Okay, anything else? Mr. Duncan.
The EDC meeting is on
Microphone.
Thursday at 8:30 in the morning. Sorry. The EDC meeting is Thursday morning at 8:30 in the morning, correct?
I have 8:30 as well, but it says 9 right now on the schedule.
Yeah, I think we moved it to 8:30 for
It's the last day of school. so yeah.
reasons. But, oh, yeah, right, because it's the last day of school, right. And I actually have to be downtown to do something, so that was okay with me too. So, can you do 8:30?
Could we follow up after this meeting on that?
Okay. Agenda items would be update on the Insight proposal, Stratford Founders Row, upcoming openings and announcements, and anything else you all have been talking with anybody about, particularly any of the condominium proposals. Those would be my ask-fors.
Okay, anything else? Should we go ahead and...
Let's adjourn.
All right, let's do it.